My mother was the most honest woman I had ever known. That is what I believed for 41 years. That is what I would have told you without hesitation, without a single flicker of doubt, if you had asked me on any ordinary day of my life, right up until the Tuesday in November, when she called me into her hospital room, waited until the nurse had closed the door behind her, and told me that almost everything I believed about my own life was wrong. 41 years. I have spent a great deal of time since that Tuesday thinking about what it means to know a person. Whether knowing someone is about the accumulation of shared time, shared meals, shared ordinary days, or whether it is something deeper than that, something that requires access to the parts of a person they keep locked away from everyone, including the people they love most. Whether you can truly know someone who has never shown you all of themselves. Whether the love between two people is real if one of them has spent decades carefully managing what the other is allowed to see. I do not have clean answers to those questions yet. I am not sure I ever will. What I have instead is a story, my story, and the story of my mother, Dorothy Mae Williams, who was by every observable measure a good woman, a loving mother, a faithful friend, a pillar of her church, a woman who had fed more hungry people at her kitchen table than she could ever count, and who had never, in 41 years of raising me, once raised her hand to me or spoken to me in a way designed to diminish me. She was also a woman who had kept a secret so large and so fundamental that when she finally released it, it rearranged every memory I had. Not the beginning of the secret. I will get there. But the beginning of me, or at least the beginning as I understood it for the first 4 decades of my life. 1. I was born and raised in a mid-sized city in Alabama. My mother, Dorothy, was 31 when she had me, which in our community and in that era was considered late for a first child, though nobody said so directly. My father, whose name was Robert Williams and who everyone called Bobby, was 34. They had been married for 6 years before I arrived, and according to the family story that I grew up on, I was very much wanted and very much prayed for, the child who came after years of hoping. My father, Bobby, was a gentle man, quiet in the way that some men are, not distant, not cold, just fundamentally more comfortable listening than speaking, more comfortable doing than saying. He worked at a manufacturing plant for 30 years. He coached Little League baseball on Saturday mornings. He made the best sweet potato pie of anyone I have ever known, including professional bakers, and he was genuinely modest about this fact in a way that I found both exasperating and deeply endearing. He died when I was 19, a heart attack, sudden, on a Thursday afternoon at work. One moment he was there, and the next moment he was not, and the world after that had a different weight to it, a different texture, the way everything does when you lose the first person you have ever truly lost. My mother handled his death the way she handled everything, with composure and with faith and with the particular forward-moving energy of a woman who understands that grief is real, but that life continues requiring things of you regardless of how you feel. She cried at the funeral, quietly with dignity. She accepted condolences with grace. She made sure everyone who came to the house was fed. And then she got up the next morning, and she kept going. I did not always understand her strength. When I was younger, I sometimes mistook it for hardness. I would watch her move through difficult things without apparent breaking, and I would feel, alongside my admiration, a small persistent wish that she would lean on me sometimes, that she would let me see the places where she struggled, that she would need me in the visible, obvious way that I needed her. She almost never did. I understand now that this was not hardness. It was protection. She was protecting me the way she had always protected me, from everything she could stand between me and, including her own pain, including for 41 years, the truth. I grew up as an only child. I did not mind this much. I had cousins nearby and friends at school, and my mother was present in the way that made a house feel full, even when it was just the two of us. She was involved, in my school, in my activities, in the details of my life in a way that felt supportive rather than intrusive most of the time. She came to every school play, every parent-teacher conference, every graduation. She helped me move into my college dormitory and did not cry until she thought I wasn't watching. And when I turned around and saw her wiping her eyes, she straightened immediately and said, "Don't mind me. I just got something in my eye. I pretended to believe her, because she needed me to. I went to a state university 2 hours from home, studied education, became a teacher. Elementary school, 3rd grade, which is my favorite grade because 3rd graders are old enough to have real conversations, but still young enough to be genuinely delighted by the world. And that combination of capacity and wonder is something I find endlessly sustaining. I have been teaching for 16 years. I am good at it. My mother was extraordinarily proud of this in the specific, detailed way she was proud of things. She did not just say she was proud. She would describe exactly what she was proud of, the specific qualities she saw in me that made her believe I was meant for this work. She said I had been patient since before I could walk. She said I had her father's eyes and my father's heart. She said she had known from the time I was 4 years old that I was going to spend my life taking care of people, and that this was not a burden I had been given but a gift. I held those words for a long time after the hospital. I still hold them. Even knowing what I know now, I hold them, because whatever else was true or untrue, her belief in me was never performed. That part was always real. I was 41 years old when my mother got sick. The diagnosis was ovarian cancer, stage 3, found later than it should have been, because my mother had a lifelong habit of not going to the doctor until she absolutely had to, a habit rooted in a complicated mixture of faith and practicality, and the particular stoicism of a woman from her generation who had been taught that you handled what you could and trusted God with the rest, and you did not make a fuss. By the time she finally went to the doctor, and then to the specialist, and then to the oncologist, the cancer was well established. The oncologist was honest with us in the way that good oncologists are, careful, clear, not brutal but not falsely hopeful either. She told us what we were dealing with, and she told us what the treatment options were, and she told us what the realistic outcomes looked like, and my mother sat in that office and listened to all of it with the same composure she brought to everything, and then she asked 2 questions. The first question was practical, something about the treatment schedule, and how it would interact with the medication she was already taking for her blood pressure. The second question surprised me. She asked the oncologist in a voice that was completely steady how much time she was likely to have if she chose not to pursue aggressive treatment. I looked at my mother when she asked that. She did not look at me. She kept her eyes on the oncologist. The oncologist gave her an honest answer. Several months, possibly closer to a year, with palliative care. The cancer was advanced, but not so advanced that the timeline was immediate. My mother nodded. She thanked the oncologist. She stood up and gathered her purse and her coat, with the unhurried movements of a woman who has made up her mind about something, and is at peace with the decision. In the car on the way home, I asked her what she was thinking. She said she was thinking about what she wanted for dinner. I said, "Mama?" She said, "Diane, I am 72 years old. I have lived a full life. I am not going to spend whatever time I have left sick from treatment that might give me a few more months I would be too ill to enjoy." I said that was not a decision she should make immediately, and she said she wasn't making it immediately. She had been making it since the moment the word cancer entered the room, and she was at peace. I cried in the car. She let me. She put her hand on mine and let me cry, and did not tell me to stop or that everything was going to be fine. She just held my hand and let me feel what I was feeling, which in retrospect was one of the most loving things she ever did for me. She chose palliative care. The months that followed had their own particular rhythm. She remained at home for most of it, in the house I had grown up in, with a rotating support system of home health aides and church friends and me. I drove to her house every weekend, without exception, and stayed from Friday evening to Sunday afternoon. I took leave from teaching for the final 2 months and moved in with her completely. We had good time together. I want to be clear about this because the story I am telling has a difficult center, and I do not want that difficulty to erase what was real and good. We had genuinely good time. We watched old movies she loved. We went through photograph albums. She told me stories about her own childhood, about her parents and her sisters, about growing up in rural Alabama in an era that was both simpler and harder than anything I had experienced. We cooked together on the days she felt well enough. We sat on the porch in the evenings and watched the neighborhood in a comfortable silence that I had grown up inside and that felt in those final months more precious than I knew how to say. She was still herself. That was the gift of the way she went. She remained herself almost until the very end. Her mind stayed clear. Her humor stayed intact, dry and specific. The kind of humor that catches you off guard and makes you laugh before you remember you are in the middle of something sad. Her faith stayed strong, not in the performed way of someone trying to demonstrate something, but in the quiet, embedded way of a woman who has genuinely never known a day without it. And she kept her secret. Right up until she didn't. It was a Tuesday. She had been having a harder week, more fatigue, more pain that the medication was working harder to manage. The hospice nurse had been in that morning. I was in the house, in the kitchen making soup she probably wouldn't eat much of, but that I needed to make, because making food was the only useful thing I could think of to do with my hands. She called my name from her bedroom, just once, but in a specific way, not urgent, not distressed, but deliberate, the way you call someone's name when you have decided to say something you have been holding for a long time and you have finally decided the time has come. I turned off the stove. I went to her room. I sat in the chair beside her bed that had become my chair over the past 2 months, positioned close enough that she could reach my hand without stretching. She looked at me for a long moment without speaking. She had her hands folded on the blanket in front of her. The afternoon light was coming through the curtains, the way it always did at that hour, the particular slant of it falling across the foot of the bed. And I remember noticing it the way you notice small sensory details when something important is happening, the way your mind tries to hold on to the ordinary edges of a moment it somehow knows is not ordinary at all. She said, "Diane, there are some things I need to tell you." I said, "Okay, Mama, I'm here." She said, "I need you to listen to all of it before you respond. I need you to let me get through all of it, because if I stop, I am not sure I will be able to start again." What my mother told me that Tuesday afternoon in November, in the slanted light of her bedroom, in the house I had grown up believing I understood, took almost 2 hours to say. She stopped several times, not because she was reconsidering, but because she needed water, or because the emotion of it caught her briefly, or because she needed a moment to organize what came next. Each time she stopped, I waited. I did not speak. I had promised her I would not, and I kept that promise, though there were moments in the listening when keeping it required everything I had. When she finished, the room was different. That is the only way I can describe it. The room was physically the same furniture, same curtains, same slant of light now going golden with the later afternoon. But I was sitting in it differently. I was a different person sitting in it than I had been 2 hours before. I am going to tell you what she told me, but first I need to tell you a little more about the woman who told it to me, because the weight of what she said cannot be fully understood without understanding who Dorothy Mae Williams was and what it cost her to say it. My mother was born in 1951, the second of 5 children, in a small town in rural Alabama that most people have never heard of, and that was, in 1951, a place where the particular cruelties of that era were not abstract or historical, but immediate and daily and woven into the fabric of ordinary life. She grew up in a household where love was real, but resources were scarce, where her parents worked themselves to the bone and still sometimes came up short, where the children understood early that the world outside their home did not value them the way their parents did, and that navigating that world required a specific kind of alertness and a specific kind of armor. She was smart, exceptionally smart, the kind of smart that her teachers recognized and commented on, and that in a different time and place might have taken her anywhere. In her time and place, it took her as far as a teaching certificate from a historically black college an hour from home, which was further than most women in her community went, and which her parents celebrated with a pride that she described to me as the best memory of her childhood. She taught school for 3 years before she married my father, Bobby. She loved teaching, she told me once, but in those years married women were expected to stop, and she stopped. And she did not say this with bitterness, because bitterness was not in her nature, but she said it with the particular flatness of a woman describing something that was simply how things were, and that she had made her peace with, even if the peace had required some work. She and Bobby were happy. She said this to me many times over the years, and I believed it, and I still believe it. Their happiness was not the dramatic, demonstrative kind. They were not a couple who made public displays or spoke in grand romantic terms. They were the kind of couple whose happiness lived in the daily, in the particular ease of two people who have learned each other's rhythms and found them compatible, who have built something together and take genuine satisfaction in what they have built. But there had been a period, she told me that Tuesday in November, before the happiness settled into something solid and reliable. A period early in the marriage when things had been harder than she had ever let me know. And it was in that period that the secret began. My mother and father had been married for 2 years when the trouble started. She did not use that word, trouble. My mother was precise with language, in the way that people who have thought carefully about something for a very long time tend to be. And she chose her words on that Tuesday afternoon, with the deliberateness of a woman who had been rehearsing this conversation in her mind for decades, and knew exactly which words she wanted, and which ones she did not. She said there had been a difficult season, early in the marriage, a season she had never spoken about to anyone, not to her sisters, not to her closest friends, not to the women at her church who had known her for 40 years. A season she had folded up and placed somewhere deep inside herself and built the rest of her life carefully around without ever disturbing it. Bobby had lost his job. This sounds simple when I say it plainly like that. A man lost his job. It happens, people recover. But I need you to understand the specific weight of that fact in the specific context of who my parents were and when and where they were living it. This was the early 1970s. My father was a black man in Alabama who had worked his way into a position at a manufacturing plant through a combination of skill and persistence and the particular kind of quiet excellence that does not give anyone an easy reason to say no. When the plant downsized and he was among those let go, he did not have the networks or the resources or the protections that might have made the landing softer. He had his pride, his work ethic, and a wife he was supposed to be providing for, and for 14 months he could not find work that matched what he had lost. 14 months. My mother said those 14 months were the hardest of her life, not because of the money, though the money was genuinely frightening, but because of what the 14 months did to my father. Bobby was a man whose sense of himself was quietly but deeply tied to his ability to provide, to show up, to be the steady thing his family could count on. When that was taken from him, something in him went quiet in a way that was different from his ordinary quietness. He withdrew. Not cruelly. My father was never cruel, but in the way a man withdraws when he is ashamed of something he cannot fix and does not know how to talk about what he's feeling, so he says nothing and hopes the nothing is not as loud as it feels to him. My mother heard it every day. She took in work where she could. Sewing, ironing, cleaning houses for women who lived on the other side of town. She did not complain about this. She was practical in the way necessity makes you practical. But she was also lonely in a way she had not anticipated. Lonely in her own marriage, living beside a man she loved who had turned a face to her she did not fully recognize, trying to hold both of them together through sheer will, while he worked through whatever he was working through in the silence of himself. It was during this period that she met a man named Calvin. My mother said his name clearly and without flinching. Calvin Reeves. She wanted me to know his full name. She said that was important to her, that she not speak about this the way people speak about things they are ashamed of, in vague terms and half descriptions, but clearly and completely, because the story deserved that, and I deserved that. Calvin Reeves was a man who worked at the dry goods store where my mother shopped. He was 33 years old to her 29. He was not from their town. He had come from somewhere in Mississippi, and had ended up in Alabama through a series of circumstances my mother did not fully know, only that he was relatively new to the area, and did not have the deep roots and interconnected relationships that most people in their community had, which meant that what happened between them stayed more contained than it might otherwise have been. She said he was kind to her at a time when she was hungry for kindness. She said this plainly and without self-justification, which I found, even in the middle of the shock of hearing it, to be exactly like her. She was not asking me to excuse it. She was asking me to understand it the way you understand a thing when you look at it with full honesty, rather than through the filter of what you wish had been true. Their involvement lasted 4 months. She ended it because she loved Bobby, and because she was not a woman who could live divided the way that kind of secret requires you to live divided, and because something in her understood that the season she and Bobby were in, hard as it was was a season and not a permanent condition, and that if she stayed and they came through it, they would come through it into something worth having. She was right about that. Bobby found work again. Not at the plant, that door had closed, but at a smaller operation across town that turned out to suit him better in ways neither of them had anticipated. The 14 months ended. Bobby came back to himself gradually, the way people do, not all at once, but in increments. And my mother was there for every increment, and they rebuilt what the difficult season had worn down, and they built it stronger than it had been before. She never told him about Calvin. She said she had made that decision consciously and had remade it many times over the subsequent years, whenever the weight of it pressed particularly hard. She had decided that telling Bobby would have been for her own relief, to put down the weight of carrying it, and not for his benefit, or for the benefit of their marriage. She had decided that some things, if they are truly over and truly past, and if the person who did them has genuinely reckoned with themselves about it, are better carried than confessed. She had made her peace with God about it, she said, in the private way that was her own business, and she had carried it. For 41 years she had carried it. I sat and listened to all of this, and I kept my promise and did not speak. And I want you to understand what that required, because by this point in her telling, I had begun to feel the particular way you feel when a story you are being told is moving towards something you have not yet been told, but that you are beginning, with a creeping and unwilling certainty, to understand. She saw it on my face. My mother had always been able to read my face with an accuracy that I found alternately comforting and inconvenient throughout my life. And even in her diminished state, even at 72, with the illness having taken more than it should have, she could read me. She said, "Yes, Diane." And she said it gently, in the voice she had used my whole life when she was confirming something difficult. She said, "Calvin is your biological father." I have thought many times since that Tuesday about what it feels like to hear a sentence that reorganizes everything. I had heard people describe this experience, and I had thought I understood it, but I did not. Not until it happened to me. Not until I sat in that chair beside my mother's bed, with the afternoon light going golden around us, and felt the ground beneath 41 years of my own identity quietly, completely shift. I did not cry immediately. I did not speak. I simply sat for a long moment in the new shape of the world and tried to find something solid to put my feet on. The mathematics of it were the first thing my mind went to, which I recognize as an odd thing to say, but it is true. The timeline, the 14 months of Bobby's unemployment, the 4 months of my mother and Calvin, my own birth date, the 6 months of marriage before my arrival that the family story had always described as a very much prayed for and finally answered gift. The pieces were rearranging themselves into a different picture without my permission, and the new picture was clear and complete in a way the old one, now that I was looking at it differently, perhaps had never quite been. Bobby had never known. That was the second thing I understood, sitting in that chair. Bobby, my father, the man who coached Little League and made sweet potato pie and died of a heart attack on a Thursday afternoon when I was 19, and whose absence had been a specific shaped absence in my life for more than 2 decades. Bobby Williams had raised me as his own child, without ever knowing I was not. He had loved me, completely, specifically in the particular way he had of loving things he cared about, quietly, practically, consistently, without drama or condition. He had coached me patiently through homework I found difficult, and driven me to every activity I wanted to try, and sat at the front of my college graduation, with a pride on his face that I can see exactly when I close my eyes even now. He had done all of this for a child who was not biologically his, without knowing she was not biologically his, which meant he had done it purely because she was his daughter. I understood, sitting in that chair, that whatever else was true, that was also true, and it was not a small truth. My mother was watching me. She had stopped speaking. She was giving me space inside the silence to absorb what she had said, before she continued, because she was still my mother, and she still knew exactly what I needed, even when what I needed was complicated. I asked her one question before she continued. I asked her if he knew. If Calvin Reeves knew about me. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That is part of what I still need to tell you." I said, "Okay." She said, "Calvin knew I was pregnant. I told him when I ended things between us. I told him because I thought he deserved to know, even though I had decided that Bobby was my husband, and Bobby was going to be this child's father, and that was not going to change. Calvin accepted that. He did not fight me on it. He was not that kind of man. But he asked me one thing before we stopped speaking entirely. She paused, took a slow breath. He asked me to tell you, she said, when the time was right, when you were old enough. He asked me to make sure you knew. Not so that he could be in your life. He understood that ship had sailed, and he accepted it, but because he believed you had a right to know where you came from. He believed that was something that belonged to you, regardless of anything else. She looked at me steadily. She said, I promised him I would, and I am a woman who keeps her promises. It just took me a great deal longer than either of us imagined. I sat with that for a moment, the image of a young man in a dry goods store in Alabama in the early 1970s, being told by a woman he cared about that she was leaving and taking with her a pregnancy that was his, but would never publicly be his, and asking only one thing, that the child eventually be told the truth, that the child be given ownership of her own story. I did not know anything about Calvin Reeves. I did not know if he was still alive. I did not know if he had other children, or had built a life somewhere, or what had become of him in the 50-some years since that conversation with my mother, in whatever private space they had found, to end something that should never have started. But I knew, hearing my mother describe that single request, that he had thought of me, a child he had never seen and would never raise, and had agreed to release entirely. He had thought of me enough to ask for that one thing, that I be told, that I be given my own truth. I did not know yet how I felt about that. I am not sure I know now entirely, but I know it was not nothing. My mother continued. There was more. She told me that Calvin had left Alabama approximately a year after their involvement ended. She did not know where he had gone. They had had no contact after the final conversation when she told him about the pregnancy, and they established the terms of his absence from my life. She had not looked for him. She had not wanted to look for him, because looking for him would have required her to engage with a part of her life she had enclosed, and she was not willing to do that while Bobby was alive, and she was not willing to do it after Bobby died, because by then I was a grown woman, and the disruption it would cause felt to her like more than she could ask me to absorb without preparing me first. Preparing me, that is the word she used. She said she had always intended to prepare me. She had imagined doing it many times, sitting me down at some right moment, finding the right words, giving me the truth in a way that was cushioned enough not to destroy anything important. The right moment had never come. That is what she said, and I understood what she meant, even as I also understood that the right moment had not come, partly because finding it would have required her to willingly enter the most painful and private chapter of her life, and she was not, despite all her strength, someone for whom that was easy. She had waited, and waiting had compounded into more waiting, and more waiting had compounded into 41 years. And now we were here, with her running out of time, and me sitting in the chair that had become my chair, with the whole shape of my life rearranging itself quietly around me. She reached out her hand. I took it. Her hand was smaller than it used to be. Illness had done that, taken something of the solidity from her, but the grip was still hers, still specific, still the grip of Dorothy Mae Williams, who had never let go of anything she intended to hold. She said, I know this is a great deal. I said, yes. She said, I know you have questions I can't answer. And I know some of what I've told you is going to take a long time to settle. I'm not asking you to be okay with it today or tomorrow, or maybe ever. I'm just asking you to know the truth, the whole truth, because you deserved it a long time ago, and I was not brave enough to give it to you until now, and I am sorry for that, Diane. I am genuinely sorry for that. It was the most directly my mother had ever apologized to me for anything. She was not a woman who found apology easy, not because she lacked remorse when she had done something wrong, but because her generation and her nature had both leaned toward handling things quietly and moving forward rather than dwelling. A direct, unqualified apology from Dorothy Mae Williams was not something I had heard many times in my life. I held her hand. I did not say it was fine, because it was not fine, and she would have known I was performing if I had said so. I said, I hear you, Mama. And I meant it in the fullest sense, not just that I had received her words, but that I understood them, understood the weight behind them, understood what it had cost her to finally say them. We sat together in the quiet for a while after that. The light in the room shifted as the afternoon moved toward evening. The house was very still. After a while she said, "There is one more thing." I looked at her. She said, "I did something some years ago, after your father, after Bobby passed. When I was going through his papers and settling his affairs, I found something that I did not expect to find, and that told me that things were perhaps not as simple as I had believed them to be." She asked me to open the drawer of her bedside table. I opened it. Inside, beneath a Bible and a small photograph and some other personal items, was an envelope, a regular white envelope, unsealed, with my name written on the outside in my mother's handwriting. She said, "Take it home with you. Read it when you're ready. Not tonight. Tonight you have enough. But when you're ready." I took the envelope. I held it in my lap for the rest of the evening. I did not open it. I kept my promise. What was inside that envelope would turn out to be the second earthquake inside the first. But that part of the story comes later. That evening, I stayed with my mother until she fell asleep. I sat in my chair and watched her the way you watch someone you love when you understand that the number of times left to watch them is finite and shrinking. The particular way her chest rose and fell, the specific lines of her face in sleep, the relaxation of muscles that in her waking hours always held a certain composure, a certain readiness. Asleep she looked briefly like a woman who had put something down, who was resting in the particular way of a person who has finished carrying something heavy. I thought about my father, Bobby. I thought about the way he had looked at me when I was small, the particular quality of his attention, the way it felt complete and specific, the way it said, "You are mine and I see you," without him ever needing those words, because words were not his primary language and had never needed to be. I thought about whether any of that changed with what I now knew, whether the love was different if the biology was different, whether the man who showed up to everything and drove me everywhere and made sweet potato pie and died too young on a Thursday afternoon and left a specific shaped absence in my life was less my father because of something neither of us had known. I decided that night that he was not. I want to be clear that this decision was not easy and not instant and not without grief and complexity underneath it. But as the first night's conclusion, sitting in a chair beside my sleeping mother with an unopened envelope in my lap, it was what I arrived at, and I believe it was right. Bobby Williams was my father. In every way that the word means anything at all, he was my father. The biology was Calvin Reeves's. The fatherhood was Bobby's. Those are two different things, and they can both be true simultaneously, and the truth of one does not cancel the truth of the other. I fell asleep in the chair sometime around midnight. When I woke up it was past 2 in the morning and the house was dark, and my mother was still sleeping, and my back ached from the chair, and the envelope was still in my lap. I went to the guest room. I set the envelope on the nightstand beside the bed. I lay in the dark and I did not sleep for a long time, and when sleep finally came it was the particular shallow sleep of a mind that is still working on something too large to set down entirely. In the morning my mother was more herself, clearer, more energetic than she had been in several days, which sometimes happens, a rallying, a gathering of resources. She made no reference to what we had discussed the evening before. She asked me what I wanted for breakfast. She commented on the quality of the morning light through the kitchen window. She was Dorothy, my mother, in the ordinary, unguarded way of mourning. I let her be that. I did not bring it back up. I understood that she had given me what she had to give, and that the conversation was hers to reopen if she chose to, and that my job now was to be present with her, in whatever way each day required, rather than to press for more than she had already offered, at considerable cost. We had 11 more days together after that Tuesday. 11 days that were both ordinary and extraordinary, in the way that final days with someone you love always are. We watched movies. We sat on the porch. She told me more stories about her childhood, stories I had not heard before, which I understand now she was offering as a form of additional context, filling in the picture of who she had been before she became the woman I had known, so that I could hold the full version of her, rather than only the version that had been available to me until that Tuesday. I listened to everything. I held all of it. She died on a Thursday morning, 12 days after she told me the truth, quietly, in her own bed, in her own house, the way she had wanted. I was there. Her breathing changed in the early morning hours, and I woke up without an alarm, and went to her room, and sat in my chair, and held her hand, and she did not regain consciousness, but I spoke to her anyway, because I believed she could hear me on some level, even if that level was deeper than waking. I told her I loved her. I told her that she had been a good mother. Not a perfect one, because perfect is not a thing that exists, but a genuinely good one. A woman who had loved me with everything she had, and had given me the best of herself even when the best was complicated by the very human things she had done and not done, and kept and finally released. I told her to rest. She took her last breath at 6:47 in the morning, with the first light just beginning at the window, and my hand around hers, and her face, in the end, completely peaceful. I sat with her for a while after. Just sat, the way you sit when something enormous has happened, and movement feels impossible and also unnecessary, and the only right thing is stillness. Then I made the calls that needed to be made. I did what needed to be done. I was Dorothy Williams's daughter in the way she had raised me to be. I handled it step by step, and I kept going. The envelope sat on my nightstand for 4 days after she died. I was not avoiding it exactly. I was giving myself time. There is a difference between avoidance and the deliberate spacing of difficult things, and I have learned to know which one I am doing, and to be honest with myself about it. This was the deliberate spacing. I knew what I was holding, and I knew I would open it when I was ready, and I trusted myself to know when ready was. Ready came on the 4th day, a Sunday afternoon, when the house had been cleaned and the immediate practical demands of death had been largely handled, and I found myself sitting at my mother's kitchen table, with a cup of tea going cold in front of me, and the particular quality of quiet that comes after people have stopped calling and stopping by, and the reality of the absence settles in fully for the first time. I got the envelope from the nightstand. I sat in the same chair I had sat in my whole life at that table. I opened the envelope. Inside were 2 things. The first was a letter in my mother's handwriting. 4 pages, front and back, written in the careful, deliberate script she had maintained her whole life. The handwriting of a woman who had been taught that how you formed your letters said something about your character, and who had taken that seriously. The second was a smaller envelope, sealed with a name written on the outside that was not mine. I read the letter first. My mother wrote the way she spoke, directly, carefully, without unnecessary ornamentation, but with a precision that made every word feel chosen rather than arrived at. Reading her letter was like sitting across from her at that kitchen table. I could hear her voice in every sentence, the particular cadences of it, the places where she paused naturally before saying something important, the places where she moved quickly through something practical, before slowing again for something that required more care. She began the letter with my name, not Dear Diane the way a formal letter begins, but simply Diane, the way she said it when she wanted my full attention, the way she had said it my entire life when something mattered. She wrote, I have told you the most important part in person because some things should not be delivered on paper. But there are things I could not find the words for in that room that I have been able to find here, in the quiet, with more time than a conversation allows. So this letter is the rest of what I owe you. Please read it knowing that every word is written with love, even the words that are hard. I set the letter down for a moment after that opening. I took a breath. I picked it up again. She wrote about Calvin. Not about their involvement. She had covered that in the hospital room with the directness she had brought to all of it. This was different. This was about what she had learned about him after. After Bobby died, and she was going through papers and settling affairs, and found something she had not been looking for, and that changed her understanding of a man she had not thought about in decades. She wrote, When your father Bobby passed, God rest him, I spent several weeks going through his papers the way you do when someone leaves, and you are the one left to sort through what they accumulated over a life. Most of it was ordinary. Insurance documents, tax records, the deed to the house, a box of photographs I had forgotten existed. I went through all of it methodically, the way I do things, and I was nearly done when I found, at the bottom of a box that had been at the back of the closet in the spare room, a manila envelope I had never seen before. She wrote, I want you to understand that what I am about to tell you is something I sat with for a very long time before I decided what to do about it. I am still not certain I made the right decision, but I made it with the information I had and with the best judgment I could bring to it, and that is all any of us can do. Inside the manila envelope my mother had found a letter. A letter addressed to Bobby Williams, in handwriting she did not recognize, postmarked from Memphis, Tennessee, dated approximately 8 months after I was born. The letter was from Calvin Reeves. I put my mother's letter down a second time when I read that. I pressed both hands flat on the table, the way I do when I need to ground myself in something solid. The kitchen was very quiet. The tea in front of me was fully cold now, and I had not touched it, and I did not touch it then. I just sat with my hands flat on the table and breathed, and then I picked up the letter again. My mother wrote, Calvin had written to Bobby. I do not know how he found Bobby's name or our address. Small towns have their ways, and this was a small town, and perhaps it was not as difficult to find as it should have been. I do not know what prompted him to write rather than appear in person, and I can only be grateful that he made that choice. What I know is what the letter said, and the letter said this. She transcribed it. Her handwriting changed slightly when she did, became more careful, more deliberate, each word formed with the particular attention of someone copying something that matters and wanting to get it exactly right. Calvin had written to Bobby Williams to tell him that he believed he might be the father of the child Bobby's wife had recently delivered. He wrote it plainly and without cruelty. He did not write it to destroy anything. The tone was not vindictive or aggressive. It was the tone of a man who had been carrying a knowledge that felt too large to carry alone, and who had decided that the other man involved deserved to know, whatever he chose to do with that knowledge. He wrote that he had been involved with Dorothy briefly, that it had ended, that he bore no ill will toward anyone, but that his conscience would not let him stay silent. He wrote that he would make no claim, would not approach Dorothy, would leave whatever happened next entirely in Bobby's hands. He wrote that he was sorry, and he wrote that whatever Bobby decided to do with the information was his right, and he would respect it. He signed it with his full name, Calvin Reeves. My mother wrote, I read that letter and I sat in the spare room for a very long time. And when I was done sitting, I understood something about your father, Bobby, that I had not known while he was alive, and that I could never ask him about now. She wrote, Bobby knew, Diane. He had known since you were 8 months old. He had read that letter, and he had made a decision, and the decision he made was you. He folded that letter and put it in a manila envelope, and put the envelope in a box at the back of a closet, and he went on being your father in every way a man can be a father, and he never said a word. Not to me, not to you, not to anyone. I was not sitting at the kitchen table anymore. I do not remember standing up, but I was standing at the window that looked out at the backyard, the same window I had looked out of my entire childhood, the yard where my father had taught me to catch a ball, and where my mother grew tomatoes every summer, and where the old oak tree still stood that I had climbed approximately 10,000 times between the ages of 6 and 12. Bobby knew. Bobby Williams had received a letter from a man named Calvin Reeves, telling him that the daughter he was raising might not be his, and he had read that letter, and he had chosen me anyway, not with drama, not with confrontation, not with a scene or an ultimatum or a confession of his own. He had simply chosen me, folded the letter, put it away, gone on being my father. He had done this without ever telling my mother he knew. He had carried it the way she had carried her half of it, quietly, privately, forward-facing, without putting the weight of it onto anyone who could not have borne it without being changed. They had both been carrying it, my whole life, in the same house, across the same dinner table, in the same bed, two people who loved each other and loved me, each holding a piece of a secret neither knew the other was holding, living the whole of their lives together, on top of something enormous, and never once letting it crack the surface of what they had built. I stood at the window for a long time. The backyard was ordinary and still. The oak tree was exactly where it had always been. The tomato beds my mother had kept for decades were bare now in November, turned over and resting. Everything looked the same as it had always looked, and nothing was the same as it had always been. And both of those things were true at the same time, and I was learning in those days after my mother died that this is simply how it is with certain revelations. They do not change what is in front of you. They change how you see it. I went back to the table. I picked up my mother's letter. I kept reading. She wrote, I know you will feel many things reading this. I know some of those things will be directed at me, and that is your right. I kept this from you for reasons I have explained, and I stand by those reasons, even knowing they will not satisfy everyone, and may not satisfy you. What I want you to understand is that what Bobby did, in my estimation, was the single most profound act of love I have ever witnessed in my life. A man found out something that would have destroyed lesser men, and he chose love. He chose you, without fanfare, without reward, without even the acknowledgement of the woman he had done it for, because that woman did not know he had done it. He just chose. Every single day for the rest of his life, he chose you. She wrote, I have missed him every day since he died, but I have missed him differently since I read that letter. I have missed a version of him I did not fully know while he was alive, a version that was larger and quieter and more extraordinary than I had understood, and I am grateful that I found it, even though I found it too late to tell him so. She wrote, I am sorry I did not find a way to tell you sooner. I am sorry for what the keeping of this cost you, the information you deserve to have, the questions you might have had answered, while there was still time to answer them. I made the decisions I made, and I lived with them, and now I am leaving you to live with them too, and that is not a small thing to ask of anyone, and I know it. And, below the name, an address in Memphis, Tennessee. My mother's handwriting, careful and deliberate. The same handwriting that had signed permission slips and birthday cards and the letter I had just finished reading. She had addressed an envelope to a man she had not spoken to in over 40 years. She had found him and written his address in her careful script, and sealed something inside, and left it in the drawer of her bedside table for me to find. I turned it over. It was sealed. She had not opened it, which meant she had put something inside it herself. She had written something intended for Calvin Reeves, and sealed it, and left it for me to send or not send as I chose. And whatever was inside that envelope was, in some fundamental sense, the final word she had wanted the chance to say, and had not been able to bring herself to send. I held it for a long time without opening it. It was not addressed to me, it was addressed to him. My mother had sealed it, and there was a decision to be made about whether I had the right to read what was inside, or whether the right thing was to send it unopened, if I chose to send it at all. I set it on the table in front of me. I looked at it. I thought about my mother and the 41 years of carrying and the 11 days after she told me, and the Thursday morning at 6:47 when she took her last breath, with the first light at the window, and my hand around hers. I thought about Bobby Williams at the back of a closet, with a manila envelope in his hands, reading a letter from a man named Calvin Reeves, and then making quietly and without telling anyone the largest decision of his life. I thought about a man in Memphis, Tennessee, who was going to be 75 in March, and who had once asked my mother for only one thing. I thought about what I wanted, what I actually wanted, underneath all the grief and the shock and the complexity. What Diane wanted for herself, with no one left to protect and no one left to manage, and the whole story finally out in the open, where she could actually see it. I wanted to know. That was the truth of it. After all of it, underneath all of it, I simply wanted to know, not just the facts, which I now largely had, but the texture, the person, the man my mother had described as kind at a time when she was hungry for kindness, the man who had written to Bobby Williams not out of cruelty, but out of conscience, the man who had asked only that I be told the truth, and had waited 50-some years without knowing whether that ask had ever been honored. I wanted to know who I had come from, not to replace anything or anyone, not to undo what Bobby Williams had built, or diminish what my mother had given me, but because I was 41 years old, and I had just lost the last parent I had known about. And somewhere in Memphis there was a 74-year-old man who was the other half of where I came from, and I had a choice about whether to let that remain an abstraction or to make it real. I opened the sealed envelope. I know my mother addressed it to Calvin. I know she sealed it. I know there is an argument that I should have sent it unopened, or not at all. But I am telling you this story completely and honestly, and the completely honest truth is that I opened it, because it was the only way I could know what she wanted to say to him, and knowing that felt, in that moment, like something I needed before I could make any decision about anything. Inside was a single sheet of paper, not 4 pages like the letter to me, 1 page, less than a full page. She had written, Calvin, I do not know if this reaches you, or if you are still at this address, or even if you are still living. I found you 3 years ago and could not find a way to write to you until now, which tells you something about how long I have been working up to this. She had written, I told her, finally, in the way I should have told her long ago. I want you to know that your only request of me, made more than 40 years ago, has been honored. She knows where she comes from. She is a remarkable woman, and she deserves to know the full truth of herself, and I gave her that, late as it was. She had written, I also want you to know something I learned after Bobby passed. He knew. He had known since she was 8 months old. He never said a word to me, or to her. He just loved her. I thought you should know that, because you wrote to him, and you deserve to know what he did with what you told him. She had written, I have thought about you more than I ever admitted to myself over these years. Not with longing. Please do not misread this as something it is not, but with the particular way you think about a person who was kind to you at a time when kindness mattered enormously, and who bore the consequences of what happened between us with more grace than most men would have managed. I am grateful for that grace. I always was. She had written, Diane will decide whether to reach out to you. That is her choice, and I have left it entirely with her where it belongs. Whatever she decides, I know she will decide it thoughtfully, because she is the most thoughtful person I have ever known, and she comes by it honestly from both sides. She had written, I hope your life has been good, Calvin. I genuinely hope that. She had signed it, Dorothy. I folded the letter, I placed it back in the envelope. I sat at the kitchen table in the quiet of my mother's house, with the gray November light at the window, and the oak tree in the yard, and my cold tea untouched in front of me, and I let myself feel all of it. The grief and the love and the shock and the strange unexpected tenderness of reading a letter a woman wrote to a man she had not spoken to in 40 years, and finding in it the same Dorothy she had always been, precise, honest, generous in ways that cost her something, unwilling to leave something important unsaid once she had finally decided to say it. She was my mother right up until the last word she put on paper. She was completely, entirely herself. I sat there until the light outside went from gray to the deeper gray of early evening. Then I got up. I washed my cold cup of tea down the drain and made a fresh one. I stood at the kitchen window with the warm cup in my hands, and I looked at the yard my mother had tended for 40 years, and I thought about what I was going to do next. There was a man in Memphis, Tennessee, who was almost 75 years old. There was an envelope with his address on it sitting on my mother's kitchen table. And there was me, Diane Williams, 41 years old, third-grade teacher, daughter of Dorothy and Bobby, standing in a kitchen in Alabama with a cup of tea and a decision to make about who I was willing to become on the other side of the most significant week of my life. I thought about my students, third-graders, the particular age when children are old enough to understand that the world is larger and more complicated than they initially believed, but young enough that this realization still fills them mostly with curiosity rather than fear. I loved that age for exactly that reason, the curiosity, the willingness to say I did not know that, and now that I know it, I want to know more, the absence of the self-protective habits that make adults so much more reluctant to step toward difficult things. I thought about what I would tell a child who was standing at the edge of something unknown and frightening and possibly wonderful. I thought about what I would say if one of my 8-year-olds came to me and said, there is something I'm scared to find out because I do not know what it will change. I would tell them that not knowing does not protect you from a thing. It only delays your relationship with it, and that delay has a cost, paid quietly over time, that eventually adds up to more than the thing you were afraid of ever would have. My mother had taught me that, the long way. I picked up the envelope. I looked at the address, Memphis, Tennessee. I had decided. Not from the address my mother had used. I would find a current one, verify it, make sure the letter reached him and did not arrive at an empty house or a forwarding address or nowhere at all. I was going to write to Calvin Reeves, and I was going to tell him that his request had been honored and that the child he had asked to be told had been told, and that she was sitting in her mother's kitchen in Alabama, trying to decide what it meant to know the full truth of yourself for the first time at 41. I was also going to send him my mother's letter, unsealed, since I had already broken that seal, but complete. She had written it for him, and he deserved to receive it. What happened after that, whether he wrote back, whether he called, whether there was more to the story that I had not yet found my way to, was not something I could predict or plan for. I was learning, in the aftermath of my mother's final gift to me, that planning had its limits, that some things could not be prepared for, and that the attempt to prepare for everything was sometimes itself the thing that kept you from living your own life fully. I was going to write the letter. I was going to send it, and then I was going to wait and see what came back. But first I was going to do something else, something smaller and more immediate and more necessary than letters to Memphis, or decisions about the future, or the long, complicated work of integrating a truth that had rearranged everything. I was going to go to the backyard. I was going to stand under the oak tree that I had climbed 10,000 times. I was going to stand there, in the gray November evening, in the yard my mother had tended and my father had mowed every Saturday of my childhood without being asked, and I was going to say thank you to both of them, out loud, to the yard and the tree in the evening, because they were gone, and the only place left to send it was out into the air, where it would have to find them however it could. Thank you for choosing me, both of you, in your different ways, in your different silences, and your different kinds of love. Thank you for building something I could grow up inside of, and call home, and carry with me into every room I have walked into since. Thank you for being, despite everything, exactly who you were. I set down my tea. I went to the back door. I opened it. The November air came in, cold and clean, and I stepped out into it. The oak tree stood in the yard, exactly where it had always stood. I walked toward it. I wrote the letter to Calvin Reeves on a Wednesday, 10 days after my mother died, 7 days after I read her letters at the kitchen table, with the cold tea in front of me, and the November light going gray at the window. I wrote it by hand. That was a decision I made deliberately, the way I had been making decisions deliberately since all of this began, not reactively, not from the first impulse, but from the considered place underneath the first impulse, where the things you actually mean tend to live. I wrote it by hand because a typed letter felt too clean, too managed, too much like a document, and not enough like a person reaching across an enormous distance to say something real. I wanted him to see my handwriting. I wanted there to be something human in the physical object that arrived in his mailbox, something that could not be mistaken for formal correspondence or legal communication, or anything other than what it was. A daughter, writing to a stranger, about the life that connected them. Finding his current address took me 3 days. My mother had found him 3 years prior through means she did not describe in her letter, and the address she had used was 3 years old, which in the life of a 74-year-old man was not necessarily reliable. I was careful about this. I did not want my letter arriving at an address where he no longer lived, sitting in a mailbox, or being forwarded to somewhere uncertain, or worst of all, being opened by someone else who had no context for what they were reading. I used a combination of public records and a people search service that felt slightly invasive and entirely necessary. What I found confirmed that Calvin Reeves was still at the address my mother had used, or had been as of 14 months ago, which was the most recent record I could locate. I decided that was current enough. I decided to trust it. I sat at my mother's kitchen table to write the letter. I thought about writing it at my own apartment, in my own space, but something pulled me back to that kitchen, to that table, to the chair I had sat in my whole life. It felt right to write it there. It felt like the right place for this particular act, in the house where the secret had been kept, at the table where my mother had finally decided to release it, surrounded by the accumulated ordinary details of a life she had built on complicated ground and maintained with genuine love. I used her stationery. She had kept a box of it in the kitchen drawer for as long as I could remember. Plain cream paper with no design, because she was not a woman who went in for decorative stationery, but good quality, the kind that felt substantial in the hand. I took 2 sheets. I uncapped a pen. I sat for a moment with my hands in my lap and thought about where to begin. I began with the truth, the most direct version of it. I wrote, "My name is Diane Williams. I am Dorothy Williams's daughter. I am writing to you because my mother passed away 11 days ago, and before she died she told me what I am about to say, and I believe you have waited a long time to know that it has been said." I wrote, "She told me the truth, the whole truth, about who I am and where I come from, and the full story of what happened between you and her, in those months a long time ago. She told me about the request you made when she ended things between you, that she'd tell me eventually, that I be given the truth of my own origins. I wrote, she honored that request, 41 years later, but she honored it. And I am writing to tell you so, because you asked for that one thing, and you deserve to know it was done. I wrote several more paragraphs after that, about my mother and who she had been, about Bobby Williams and what I had learned about him from the letter in the manila envelope at the back of the closet, about where I was in the processing of everything, which I tried to describe honestly, not as a woman who had arrived somewhere, but as a woman who was in the middle of a journey she had not chosen and was navigating as deliberately as she could. I wrote that I did not know what I wanted from reaching out. I wanted him to understand that clearly. I was not writing with an agenda or an expectation or a demand of any kind. I was writing because my mother had left his address and her sealed letter and a choice, and the choice I had made was toward contact rather than away from it, because not knowing had already cost enough in this story, and I was not willing to add to that cost on my own behalf. I included my mother's letter. I folded it carefully, the single page in her handwriting addressed to Calvin, and I placed it in the envelope along with my own letter. I wrote his address on the front in my own handwriting, which is rounder and less formal than my mother's, the handwriting of a teacher who has spent years making her letters legible and approachable for 8-year-olds. I looked at the sealed envelope for a moment. Then I put it in my bag. I took it to the post office that afternoon, rather than leaving it for the next day's mail, because I had learned from watching my mother's long delay what waiting costs, and I did not want to give myself the opportunity to reconsider. I handed it across the counter. The postal worker weighed it and told me the postage, and I paid, and she put it in the bin behind her, and that was that. The letter was gone, out of my hands, making its way to Memphis, Tennessee, to a man I had never met who was almost 75 years old and who had asked for one thing 40-some years ago, and was about to learn that the answer was yes. I walked back to my car in the parking lot, and I sat in it for a few minutes without starting the engine. The day was cold and clear, the particular brightness of a November day when the sun is out but offering no warmth, and the parking lot was ordinary, and the world was continuing around me in its ordinary way, and I had just done something that could not be undone. That is the thing about reaching toward an unknown. The moment you do it, the reaching itself changes the landscape. The possibility is no longer theoretical. The door is no longer hypothetical. You have put your hand on it, and whatever is on the other side now has access to the same door from its direction. I started the car. I drove back to my mother's house. I made dinner. I ate it at the kitchen table. I washed the dishes. I went to bed. I waited. The waiting was its own experience. I went back to my own apartment after another few days at my mother's house. There were practical things to manage there, but I needed to be in my own space, in my own life, with my own walls around me, and my own routines to hold on to, while the larger things sorted themselves out in the background. I went back to work 2 weeks after my mother's funeral, because being with my students was, I discovered, genuinely sustaining in a way that staying home was not. Children who are 8 years old are not thinking about mortality or family secrets or the complicated legacies of the people who raised them. They are thinking about spelling tests and who said what at recess and whether there is time to finish the chapter before the bell. Being inside that world for 6 hours a day was not an escape from what I was going through. I was too honest with myself to call it that. It was a counterweight, something light and immediate and requiring my full attention in a way that balanced the heavy and complex things I carried home with me every afternoon. I checked my mailbox with a different quality of attention than I had before. I noticed myself doing this, the particular way I looked at the stack of envelopes each day, the brief but distinct feeling of something that was not quite anticipation and not quite dread, but lived in the territory between them. I did not know how long a response would take. I did not know if a response would come at all. The man was 74 years old. He might be in poor health. He might have moved. He might receive my letter and my mother's letter and decide after all this time that the right response was no response, that the opening of this door at this late stage of his life was more than he wanted to walk through. I had to be genuinely prepared for that possibility. I thought about it carefully and honestly. If he did not respond, what would I do with that? I decided I would be disappointed, but not destroyed by it. I had the truth my mother had given me. I had the letter from Bobby's closet. I had a complete enough picture of where I had come from to go forward with my life in a way that felt honest and whole. His response, if it came, would be additional. It would be more. But the absence of it would not leave me with nothing. This was important to decide in advance. I had learned from the experience of the past weeks that the decisions made in advance of difficult moments are more reliable than the ones made inside them. You think more clearly before the emotion arrives than after it. You make better agreements with yourself about what you will do and who you will be when you are not yet in the middle of the thing you are trying to navigate. I decided in advance that I was okay either way, and I believe I meant it. 19 days after I mailed the letter, a response arrived. It came on a Tuesday, which struck me as significant only in retrospect. It was a Tuesday when my mother had called me into her room and begun telling me the truth. And it was a Tuesday when the response from Memphis arrived. And I do not know if this means anything, but I noticed it. It was a standard white envelope, my name and my mother's address. I had used my mother's address as the return, thinking that if anything was going to come back, it should come there, to the house where the story had started and been kept, which in some way I cannot fully articulate, felt right. My name and handwriting I did not recognize, a Memphis postmark, standard forever stamp. I sat down before I opened it. I was in my own apartment, having picked up the mail I'd been having forwarded from my mother's address during the period of settling her estate. I sat on the couch. I held the envelope. I took a full breath, the way I had learned to take a full breath before something important. All the way in, all the way out, letting the body settle, before asking it to receive something that might require steadiness. I opened the envelope. Inside was a letter, 4 pages, handwritten on lined notebook paper, in the careful, deliberate script of a man who had perhaps not written many letters by hand in recent years, but who was making the effort. The letters formed with visible tear. The lines followed closely, the words chosen with the evident thought of someone who understood that what he was saying mattered and wanted to say it right. He began with my name, too. Just Diane, no dear, just my name, the way my mother had begun hers to me. He wrote, "I have read your letter and your mother's letter 4 times each. I have been sitting with them for almost 3 weeks, trying to find the right words to respond. And I am not sure I have found them even now. But I have found some words, and I am going to send them. Because waiting any longer feels wrong when you have already waited long enough." He wrote, "First, thank you for writing, for finding me, for honoring what your mother told you with enough courage to reach out to a stranger who must be, at minimum, a complicating presence in the story of your life. I know this cannot have been a simple decision, and I want you to know I understand that and I am grateful you made it." He wrote, "Your mother's letter, I read it and I wept. I am 74 years old and I am not a man who cries easily, and I am telling you this not to be dramatic, but because I think you should know the effect her words had. She was, in the brief time I knew her, one of the most honest and decent people I had ever met, and reading her words after all this time confirmed that she remained exactly who she was. Her honesty and her decency came through every sentence. I am glad she found peace. I am glad she got to be your mother for 41 years. She deserved that, and from everything you have written, it sounds as though you did too." He wrote, "You told me about Bobby Williams, about the letter in the manila envelope at the back of the closet. I want you to know that I have thought about Bobby Williams many times over the years. I thought about him when I wrote that letter to him. I will not pretend that writing it did not cost me something, because it did, because I was telling a man something that could have destroyed his marriage and his sense of himself, and I did not take that lightly. I wrote it because I believed he had a right to the truth, even though the truth was going to be painful. And I told myself afterward that whatever he decided to do with it was his business and his right, and that I had done what my conscience required, and the rest was not mine to control." He wrote, "What you have told me about what Bobby did with that letter, what he chose, and how he chose it, and the way he carried it silently for the rest of his life, I want you to know that reading those words was one of the most humbling experiences of my life. That man chose you, every single day, without anyone asking him to, without anyone knowing, without reward or acknowledgement. He just chose to be your father, because you were his daughter, and that was all the reason he needed. I have a great deal of respect for Bobby Williams. I had it before I knew what he did, because a man who could inspire the love your mother had for him was clearly a man worth respecting. I have considerably more of it now. I stopped reading for a moment. I was on my couch in my apartment, and it was a Tuesday afternoon in December, and outside my window, the city was doing its ordinary city things, and I was sitting very still in the middle of it, with a letter from Memphis in my hands, and my eyes were full, in a way they had been full many times in the past weeks, but this felt different. This felt like the specific emotion of hearing someone say something true about a person you loved, who is gone, and can no longer hear it said. Bobby Williams, who had never in his life asked for recognition for anything, who had made the largest decision of his life in the back of a closet with a letter in his hands, and then put the letter away and gone on making sweet potato pie and coaching Little League and showing up to everything, and never once asked to be seen for any of it. He was being seen now, by a man he had never met, in a letter I was reading in an apartment that existed because of the life Bobby had helped make possible. 40 years after the fact, Bobby Williams was being seen. I let myself cry for a few minutes, not the restrained, managed kind. The real kind, the kind that comes from somewhere deeper than the eyes and that does not respond to instruction or composure. I let it come and I let it pass, and then I wiped my face, and I kept reading. Calvin wrote, "I want to tell you some things about my life, because I think you have a right to know them, and because your letter suggested, without demanding, a curiosity about who I am beyond the role I have played in your story. I want to honor that curiosity as directly and honestly as I can." He wrote, "I left Alabama in the year after your mother and I ended things. I went to Memphis because I had a cousin there who had offered me work, and because staying in a small town where I knew what I knew and was not free to acknowledge it felt like more than I could manage long term. Memphis suited me. I have been here ever since, which is to say for 50-some years, which means Memphis has been my home considerably longer than anywhere else I have ever lived." He wrote, "I married. Her name was Louise, and she was a remarkable woman, a nurse, sharp-minded and warm-hearted, with a laugh that you could hear from 3 rooms away and that I never got tired of hearing in all the years we had together. We were married for 38 years. She passed 6 years ago. Breast cancer. I will not say more than that, except that her absence is the central loss of my adult life, and that I am managing it the way you manage the loss of a person who is also a place, by building a life inside the space she left, and filling it as best I can with things that would have made her glad." He wrote, "We had 2 children, a son named Marcus, who is 47 and lives in Atlanta and works in urban planning, a daughter named Simone, who is 43 and lives in Memphis near me, and who has 3 children of her own, who I am, I say without any false modesty, an excellent grandfather to." I stopped reading again. 2 children. A son named Marcus in Atlanta. A daughter named Simone in Memphis, which meant I had, if the word applied, and I was not yet sure it did, a half-brother and a half-sister. People who existed in the world, living their lives, who shared a biological parent with me, and had no idea I existed. The scope of it kept expanding. Every time I thought I had arrived at the full shape of what I was dealing with, it revealed another dimension I had not fully accounted for. I had gone from being an only child, a woman who had grown up without siblings, and had made peace with that, and built a life that did not require them, to being in some biological sense, one of 3. 3 children of a man in Memphis, who was going to be 75 in March. I sat with that for a long time before continuing. He wrote, "Marcus and Simone do not know about you. I want to be clear about that. This is not because I kept your existence as a secret from them in the deliberate, sustained way that secrets are kept. It is more that your existence was always a theoretical thing to me, an abstraction, a pregnancy I was told about and then was asked to step away from, and then I stepped away from as agreed. I could not speak of you as a real person because I did not know you as a real person. You were a fact I carried and a promise I asked your mother to keep, but you were not someone I could describe or talk about or grieve the absence of in the way you grieve someone whose presence you have experienced." He wrote, "Now you are real. You have written me a letter in round handwriting that tells me you are a teacher, and that you are deliberate, and that you are working through something enormous with more grace than most people bring to far smaller things. You are real now, and I do not know yet what that means for Marcus and Simone, but I know it is something I will need to think carefully about. He wrote, I am not asking anything of you, Diane. I want to be as clear about that as you were in your letter. I am not asking for a relationship or a role or anything that does not come from your own genuine desire and your own genuine readiness. You have already given me more than I had any right to expect. You wrote, you told me it was done, you sent your mother's warrants to me across all these years. That would have been enough. He wrote, but I would be dishonest if I did not tell you that reading your letter made me want to know more. That finding out you are real and thoughtful and teaching third graders in Alabama and standing under oak trees and processing enormous things with the kind of quiet dignity your mother always had, finding all of that out has made me want to know the rest. Whatever the rest is, whatever you are willing to give of it. He wrote, I am 74 years old. I have learned at this age not to leave things unsaid when the opportunity to say them presents itself. Your mother took 41 years to say what she needed to say, and she ran out of time to say more than she managed. I would rather err in the other direction. He wrote, so I will say it plainly. I would like to know you. If you want that too, I am here. If you need more time, I have it. If you decide that what you have is enough, and you do not want more contact, I will honor that completely without bitterness or argument. Whatever you choose, the choosing is yours. He wrote, one more thing and then I will close because this letter is already longer than I planned, and I am aware I am an old man who has perhaps said more than was strictly necessary. He wrote, your mother asked me in her letter to hope that my life has been good. I want to answer that directly because she asked it, and I believe she deserved a direct answer, even though she will not be able to read it now. Yes, Dorothy, my life has been good. I have had grief in it and loss in it, and the particular complicated weight of knowing things I was not free to speak about. But I have had Louise. I have had Marcus and Simone, and 3 grandchildren who think I am the best person alive, which I am not, but I treasure their conviction. I have had Memphis, which is a city I love with a specificity that only comes from staying somewhere long enough to know its particular personality. I have had a good life. I wish I could tell her so. He wrote, perhaps you can carry that to wherever she is now. I believe she went somewhere. I believe that about people like Dorothy. He signed it Calvin Reeves. And then below his signature, as a postscript, he had added, Marcus works in Atlanta. I mention this only because you are in Alabama, and Atlanta is not far, and because sometimes the world arranges things in ways that are worth noticing. I folded the 4 pages along their lines. I placed them back in the envelope. I sat on my couch in my apartment on a Tuesday afternoon in December, and I held the envelope in my lap, and I thought about everything. My mother, who had kept this for 41 years and given it to me in the last weeks of her life with the particular courage of a woman who had run out of the luxury of waiting. My father, Bobby, who had read a letter in a closet and made a decision so large and so quietly loving that it had taken 40 years and a dead man's papers to bring it to light. A man in Memphis who had spent 50 years carrying a question about whether the one thing he asked for had ever been honored, and who had just found out the answer was yes. And somewhere in Atlanta, a man named Marcus who was 47 years old and worked in urban planning, and had no idea that in Alabama there was a 41-year-old third-grade teacher who was sitting on a couch holding a letter and thinking about a drive to Atlanta that was maybe 2 hours from her mother's house. The world arranges things in ways that are worth noticing. I thought about what I wanted. I did what I had learned to do. I went underneath the first impulse and the second one, and found the considered place where the things I actually meant lived. What I found there was this. I wanted to meet him. Not Marcus first, that was a different and more complicated question that deserved its own time and its own consideration. But Calvin. I wanted to meet the man who had written 4 pages on notebook paper, with the careful script of someone making the effort of honesty. I wanted to sit across from him and understand, in the physical, immediate way that letters cannot fully provide, who he was and what it felt like to be in the same room as him. I wrote back the same week. I kept my letter shorter this time. I had said the major things already, and what remained was simpler. I told him I had received his letter and read it many times. I told him what it had meant to me to hear him speak of Bobby the way he had. I told him about Louise briefly, that I was sorry for his loss, that 38 years was a long and beautiful thing, and that its ending must have left a specific shaped absence, the way Bobby's death had left one in my mother and in me. I told him I wanted to meet him. I told him I could come to Memphis, that I had a school break coming at the end of the month that gave me a long weekend I could use, that if he was open to it, I would like to come on a Friday and have Saturday and Sunday for whatever the meeting required in terms of time and space and conversation. I told him I had no agenda for the meeting beyond simply being present with another human being who shared some portion of where I came from, that whatever happened, happened, that I was not arriving with expectations or prepared speeches or a list of things I needed him to be. I mailed that letter on a Thursday morning. The response came in 8 days, which was faster than the first one, as though he had been thinking about it before the question was even asked. He wrote, "Come, I will be here. Tell me the date, and I will have coffee ready and we can start there and see where it goes." He wrote one more thing, a single additional line after that which I have thought about many times since. He wrote, "I have been waiting 50 years for this. 8 more days is nothing." I booked a hotel room in Memphis that evening, not because I thought I would need the distance. I had not yet decided how much distance I would need, but because I wanted my own space to return to at the end of each day. My own 4 walls where I could sit with whatever the day had given me and process it privately before the next one. The drive from Alabama to Memphis takes approximately 5 hours. I drove it on a Friday morning in late December, 3 days before Christmas, which I had chosen deliberately because the holiday gave me several days that did not require explanation to anyone. My school was on break. My schedule was my own. There was no one waiting for me to be anywhere other than exactly where I was going. The drive was its own thing, 5 hours alone in a car, with the highway and the winter landscape, and the particular kind of thinking that long drives produce. Not the focused, directed thinking of a problem being solved, but the slower, more associative thinking of a mind given space to wander through something without pressure. I thought about my mother. I thought about Bobby. I thought about my students, who had sent me home before break with handmade cards and drawings that I had arranged on the windowsill of my apartment in a way that made me happy every time I looked at them. I thought about who I was going to be on the other side of this drive and this weekend, whether this was a door I was walking through or a window I was looking through, and what the difference between those two things was. I arrived in Memphis at early afternoon. I checked into the hotel. I stood at the window of my room looking out at a city I did not know at all. It looked like what it was, a city, large in particular, with its own history and its own personality and its own accumulated weight. The Mississippi was not visible from my window, but I knew it was there, somewhere, doing the thing rivers do, which is to move continuously forward, regardless of what is happening on their banks. I thought that was something. I had his address from his letters. I had been over it many times. I knew the neighborhood. I had looked it up, as people do now, and seen the street, and the approximate house, and the trees in front of it. I had not called ahead for that day's arrival. We had agreed on Saturday morning for the meeting itself, and I wanted to honor that agreement and not arrive early and unannounced at an old man's house, because showing up ahead of time said something about your state of mind that I did not want to say. So I stayed in the hotel that first evening. I ordered food to the room. I sat at the small desk, and I wrote in the journal I had been keeping since my mother's diagnosis, a practice my therapist had suggested and that I had resisted for 2 weeks and then surrendered to and found genuinely useful. I wrote about the drive and the city outside the window and how I was feeling, which was a combination of things that did not have a single name. Nervous was part of it, but not the dominant part. There was something closer to the feeling of standing at the edge of something real. Not the managed theoretical approach to the real thing, but the actual edge of it, where you could feel the air differently. I slept better than I expected to. In the morning I woke up before my alarm. I lay in the hotel bed in the quiet of the early hour, and I thought about my mother. I thought about her often in the mornings. Mornings had been her best time, the time when she was most herself, most energetic, most present. The mornings were when I missed her most specifically. I got up. I got ready with the care I brought to things that mattered. Not overdressing, not performing, but choosing what I wore thoughtfully, wanting to arrive as myself. I ate a small breakfast in the hotel restaurant, without tasting much of it. At 9:30 on a Saturday morning in December, 3 days before Christmas, I drove to the address on the letters. The house was a neat, single-story brick house on a quiet residential street. The kind of house that spoke of long occupancy, the landscaping established and cared for, the mailbox solid and practical, a wreath on the front door that I would later learn was put up every year by his daughter Simone, and that he always said he did not need, and always left up until February. A car in the driveway that was clean and not new. I sat in my car in front of the house for approximately 3 minutes. I looked at the house. I thought about the chain of events that had produced this moment. The manufacturing plant that laid off Bobby Williams in the early 1970s. The 14 months of difficult silence. A dry goods store, 4 months, a pregnancy, a letter in a manila envelope at the back of a closet. My mother's hands folding a page on a Tuesday afternoon in November. An envelope posted from Alabama to Memphis. A response on notebook paper in careful handwriting. A 5-hour drive. A hotel room. A Saturday morning. 50-some years of events that had produced this particular moment on this particular street. I got out of the car. I walked to the front door. I knocked. The door opened after a moment that was long enough to notice, but not long enough to be uncomfortable. Just the ordinary moment of a person making their way from wherever they were in the house to the front door, unhurried, which told me something about his state of mind. A man who was nervous would have been at the door already. A man who had been waiting anxiously would have heard my car in the driveway and been at the threshold before I knocked. The ordinary unhurried moment told me that whatever Calvin Reeves was feeling on this December Saturday morning, he was not rattled by it. He was meeting it the way he apparently met things, steadily, at his own pace. The door opened, and I saw him for the first time. I want to be honest about what that moment was like, and I want to resist the temptation to make it more cinematic than it actually was, because the truth of it was both simpler and more profound than anything I could dramatize. It was just a man at a door, a tall man, still tall even at 74, though he had lost some of the height that the younger version of himself probably carried more easily, with a deep brown complexion and a face that had been shaped by 7 decades of living into something that was neither young nor old in the way those words are usually meant, but was instead simply fully inhabited. The face of a person who had been present for their own life. His hair was white, almost completely white, close-cropped, the kind of white that reads not as absence but as arrival, as though his hair had earned its current color through a long and honorable process. He was wearing a plain blue sweater and dark pants and house shoes that he had apparently not thought to change before answering the door, which I found immediately and unexpectedly endearing. He looked at me. I have thought many times about what he saw when he looked at me. I had looked at myself in the hotel mirror that morning with a different quality of attention than I usually brought to mirrors, looking not for the ordinary catalogue of appearance, but for something else, looking for evidence of inheritance, looking for the places where my face answered questions that my mother's face had always raised without my fully realizing it. The things that did not come from Dorothy's side, the things that had always been slightly unaccounted for in the family resemblance conversations that happen naturally in families, where everyone is looking for themselves in each other. I had found some things in that mirror. The height. I was taller than my mother, and had always been attributed to a vague General Williams tallness that nobody could quite specify. The particular shape of my forehead, broader than my mother's, with a hairline that started differently. The way my hands were shaped, longer fingers, a different proportion of palm to digit that my mother's hands had never shared. When Calvin Reeves looked at me in his doorway, I watched him find these things too. I watched it happen across his face, not dramatically, not in a gasp or a visible shock, but in the quiet way that recognition moves through a person who has been expecting something and is now receiving the confirmation of it. His eyes moved over my face with the careful attention of someone reading something important and wanting to get it right. Then he stepped back and held the door open wider and said, "Come in, Diane." His voice was low and measured and warm in the particular way of a person who has spent a lifetime talking to people and has learned through long practice the difference between a voice that comforts and a voice that performs comfort. I went in. The inside of the house was exactly what the outside had suggested. a home that had been lived in for a long time by a person who paid attention to it. Not elaborately furnished, he was not a man of elaborate furnishings, but considered. Everything in the right place, maintained with care, with the particular warmth that accumulates in a house that has held a lot of life. There were photographs on a side table near the entrance. A wedding photograph I assumed was Calvin and Louise, a younger man who must have been Marcus, a woman with a wide smile who must have been Simone, 3 small children at various ages who were clearly the grandchildren, a bookshelf with well-used books, a plant in the corner near the window that was clearly thriving, tended to regularly, which struck me as the kind of small domestic detail that says something true about a person without meaning to. He led me to the living room. There was a low table in front of the sofa with 2 cups already set out, and a coffee pot, and a small plate of something covered in plastic wrap that he uncovered without comment to reveal a neat arrangement of shortbread cookies that were clearly homemade. I looked at the cookies and something moved through me that I could not immediately name. I named it later. It was recognition of effort. He had baked. On the morning that his daughter's daughter, the child he had never been allowed to know, was coming to his house for the first time, he had baked shortbread cookies and put them on a plate and covered them with plastic wrap to keep them fresh and set them on the table. This was not a small thing. This was the act of a person who did not know what to bring to an unprecedented situation and had defaulted to the thing humans have always defaulted to when they do not know what else to offer. Care made tangible. I sat on the sofa. He sat in the armchair across from me. He poured coffee without asking how I took it, which made me smile inwardly, and then he asked how I took it, which made me smile more. I told him, and he fixed it and handed it to me, and we both wrapped our hands around our cups in the way of people settling in for something that matters. We sat for a moment in a silence that was not uncomfortable. That surprised me. I had expected the silence between us to be awkward in the way silences are between strangers who are trying to figure out where to begin, but it was not awkward. It was something closer to the silence between people who had already said a great deal to each other, which, through the letters we had, we were not starting from zero. We were starting from somewhere in the middle, which is a very different thing. He spoke first. He said, "You look like your mother." And then immediately after, before I could respond, he said, "And you look like yourself." I did not know how to anticipate what you would look like, and now that I see you, I can see both of those things are true simultaneously. I said I had been looking in mirrors differently lately. He nodded like he understood exactly what I meant. He said, "How was the drive?" I said, "Long, good. The kind of drive that gives you time to think things you have been putting off thinking." He said, "I know that kind of drive." We talked for a while about ordinary things first, Memphis and Alabama, teaching 3rd grade, his grandchildren, who he described with the unguarded warmth that grandparents bring to the subject of grandchildren when they are not trying to be modest about it, which he was clearly not trying to be. He told me about the youngest one, a girl named Cora, who was 6, and who had recently decided that she wanted to be a marine biologist, which he found both entirely plausible and enormously amusing. I told him that 6-year-olds deciding to be marine biologists was not at all unusual in my experience, and that the percentage who followed through was lower than they expected, but that the ambition itself was healthy and should be encouraged. He laughed at that. His laugh was warm and genuine and landed in the room the way good laughs do, making the air and the space feel lighter. I filed the laugh away, not consciously, not strategically, but the way you file things that feel important and that you want to be able to find again later. I had my father Bobby's laugh in a similar internal file. The specific quality of it, the way it had always made whatever room he was in feel warmer. This laugh was different, but it was also in some way I could not fully articulate, familiar in a different direction. After a while, the conversation moved toward the things we had come to talk about. Not abruptly. Neither of us was an abrupt person, which was itself something I noted as a similarity, however small, and however much it might be coincidence rather than inheritance. It moved naturally, the way conversations move when the people in them are ready. He told me about the period when he had known my mother. He was careful about this, careful not to speak of her in ways that felt inappropriate or that reduced what she had been to him to something smaller or larger than the truth. He said it the way he said everything, directly and with evident thought. He said she had been a person of remarkable quality. He said the time he had known her had been brief and had ended as it should have ended, with her choosing her marriage and her life and the person she had committed to. He said he had never blamed her for that choice and had never tried to re-enter what he had agreed to exit. He said the letter he had written to Bobby Williams was the only contact he had made, and that after sending it, he had kept his word completely. I asked him why he had written the letter to Bobby. What had moved him to do it? He was quiet for a moment, holding his coffee cup, looking at a point somewhere in the middle distance between us. Then he said, I wrote it because I believed he had a right to the truth about his own life. I wrote it because I had been raised by a man, my own father, who had been kept from a truth about his own life that he deserved to have, and that the keeping of it had done harm. Not the same situation, not even close to the same situation, but the principle felt the same to me. A man deserves to know the truth of his own life. The consequences of that truth are his to manage. It was not my place to decide he was better off not knowing. I thought about that for a moment. Then I said, he decided he was better off not knowing, or not responding to what he knew. He read the letter and he chose not to act on it. Calvin nodded slowly. He said yes, and that was also his right. I told him the truth and I left the choosing to him, and he chose. I can respect that completely, even knowing the choice meant I was never going to be part of your life. I said, did you want to be part of my life? He looked at me for a long moment. He did not look away or deflect or soften the question the way people sometimes do when an honest answer is complicated. He said, I thought about it, in the way you think about something that is not available to you, not as a plan, not as an intention, but as a thing that exists in the space of what might have been. I thought about who you were growing up and who you were becoming, and whether you were being loved the way you deserved to be loved. And I told myself that you were, that Dorothy was your mother, and she was extraordinary, and Bobby Williams had chosen you, and that was enough, that you were enough, that your life was full enough without me in it. He said whether I was telling myself that because it was true, or because it was the only thing I could tell myself that was bearable, that I cannot say with certainty even now. The honesty of that hit me somewhere deep, the willingness to sit inside the complexity of his own answer, without resolving it cleanly in one direction or the other. I recognized that quality. It was the quality my mother had brought to her own story, not the false resolution of a person who needs everything to make sense, but the honest sitting with, of a person who knows that some things contain contradictions that do not resolve, and that the most truthful thing you can do is acknowledge them rather than paper over them. I said, my mother said you were kind, that at a time when she was hungry for kindness, you were kind to her. He looked down at his coffee cup. He said, I tried to be. I hope I was. I said, she believed you were. Those were her words and she chose them carefully. He said she always chose her words carefully. I said, yes, she did. We sat with that for a moment. The shortbread cookies sat on the plate between us untouched, which somehow seemed appropriate for that particular stretch of the conversation. Some moments do not accommodate eating. After a while I asked him about Marcus and Simone, not because I had a plan. I had genuinely not decided what I wanted regarding the half-siblings I had apparently acquired along with everything else, but because I was curious about them in the way I was curious about everything that was connected to this story. I wanted to understand the full shape of the world I had entered. He talked about them the way he had talked about his grandchildren, with warmth and specific detail, the kind of description that tells you someone has paid close attention to the people they are describing. Marcus he described as methodical and principled, a man who approached every problem the same way, whether it was a professional challenge or a personal one, with research and deliberation and a commitment to doing the thing properly. He said Marcus was the kind of man who read the instructions before attempting anything, and always had the right tool for the job. He said this with a fondness that told me he found it both admirable and fatally amusing. Simone he described differently. He said she was the family's center of gravity, that people orbited her naturally because she had the quality of making everyone in her vicinity feel both seen and comfortable, which was a combination rarer than people tended to recognize. He said she was funny in the way that people are funny when they are also deeply intelligent. the humor coming from an excess of perception rather than from an effort to perform. He said she was the reason the family stayed connected, the organizer of gatherings, the keeper of birthdays and anniversaries, and the occasion of someone needing to feel remembered. He said both of these things about his children, and then he looked at me and said, "They don't know about you." I said, "I know, you mentioned that in your letter." He said, "I have been thinking about that since I sent the letter, about what is right, about what they deserve to know, and when and how." I said, "That is your decision, yours and theirs. I am not putting any pressure on that direction." He said, "I know, but I want you to know that I am thinking about it, that my inclination is toward honesty, which you might have gathered from my general approach to things, and that I do not believe I can know you and not eventually tell them. It would feel like another kept secret, and I am not interested in kept secrets at this point in my life." I said, "When you are ready. If and when you are ready, there is no urgency from my side." He nodded. He said, "I appreciate that." And then he said, "Can I ask you something?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Are you all right with all of it?" "Not fine. I know you are probably managing and functioning and keeping yourself upright, which from what I can tell is something you do very well. Are you all right?" I thought about how to answer that honestly. I took the time the question deserved. I said, "I am in the process of being all right. Some days more than others. The grief for my mother is still very present. And the grief has this other layer now, the layer of finding out things that reframe the grief, that make me miss a version of her I did not know while she was alive, and that make me miss my father Bobby for different reasons than I used to miss him. It is a lot to hold at once. But I am holding it." He said, "You are your mother's daughter." I said, "I am apparently also something of yours, which is still very new information." He smiled at that, a real smile, not the careful managed smile of a person navigating a difficult conversation, but the spontaneous kind that arrives without permission. He said, "Yes, I suppose you are." And then he said, "I am not sure yet what that means for either of us, but I'm glad to be finding out." I said, "So am I." We talked for 4 hours that first day. Not continuously about the deep things, the way long conversations work. They move between depth and surface, between the weighty and the ordinary, because sustained weight without relief becomes unbearable, and the ordinary things are what let you keep going. We talked about Memphis and its history, which he knew thoroughly, and spoke about with the love of long habitation. He told me about Louise, not just her death, but her life, the 38 years of her, the specific ways she had shaped the world she moved through, and the people in it. He showed me a photograph from the side table, the wedding photograph I had noticed when I came in, and I looked at it and saw young Calvin, who was clearly the young man my mother had described, the one in the dry goods store, with the quality of being new to the town, and therefore unentangled in its web of history and connection. And beside him, a young Louise with a smile that even in a photograph from decades ago communicated exactly what he had described: warmth, intelligence, the quality of making people in her vicinity feel comfortable. I told him about my teaching. He was genuinely interested in a way that was not polite performance. He asked specific questions about how third graders learn differently from other ages, about what I found most challenging and most rewarding, about whether I had ever considered other grade levels, and what had kept me at third. The specificity of his questions told me he was listening fully rather than waiting for his turn to speak, which is rarer than it should be, and which I noticed and appreciated. He fed me lunch. He had made a pot of soup, a vegetable soup, substantial and well-seasoned, the kind of soup that takes time and attention. He served it with cornbread that he had also made, which he brought out of the oven at exactly the right moment, as though he had been tracking the timing of our conversation with some part of his attention the whole time. I ate more than I expected to. I told him the cornbread was excellent, and he said his daughter Simone had taught him to make it after Louise died, which he found slightly embarrassing in a way that made him tell it with a humor that told me he had made his peace with it. I thought about what it meant that a 74-year-old man whose wife had died had learned from his daughter how to make cornbread. I thought about the picture it painted of who he was in his family, not a man who had retreated into helplessness when Louise left, but a man who had enrolled in the ongoing project of his own daily life, and let the people who loved him teach him what he needed to know. There was a dignity in that, a specific kind of masculine dignity that was not about invulnerability, but about willingness. The willingness to be a student of your own life, even when you were 74 and had already lived most of it. I thought about Bobby Williams making sweet potato pie. I thought about how the two men, the one who had raised me and the one who had made me, were different in almost every external way, and yet shared this quality of domestic capability and quiet care. Whether that was coincidence, or whether it said something about what my mother had been drawn to in people, I cannot say, but I noticed it. After lunch we sat on the porch for a while, in the winter air, which was cold but still, the kind of stillness that December brings, when the wind is absent and the light is flat and everything feels slightly suspended. He had blankets, thick ones, and brought them out without being asked, one for each of us, and we sat in 2 chairs on his porch, wrapped in blankets, and drank coffee, and looked at the quiet street, and talked in the easier, more meandering way of an afternoon that has already gotten through the harder morning. He told me about a trip he and Louise had taken to New Orleans the year before she was diagnosed. He described it in the kind of detail that tells you a memory has been returned to many times, held carefully, kept deliberately accessible. The hotel, the food, the specific evening they had sat on a balcony somewhere, and listened to music coming up from the street below, and looked at each other with the particular look of 2 people who have been together for a long time and are in a moment of being completely aware of how good that is. I said it sounded beautiful. He said it was. He said he was grateful they had done it when they had, rather than waiting for a later time that turned out not to exist. I thought about things I had been waiting for. I thought about my mother and the things she had waited to say until there was almost no time left to say them. I thought about the costs of waiting and the things that accumulate in the waiting, and how the weight of them grows invisibly until it is suddenly very heavy all at once. When I sent the letter, he said, there was never a possibility that I would not write back. I said, I know that now, but I did not know it when I was waiting. He said, no, I suppose you couldn't have. I'm sorry for the uncertainty. I said, do not apologize. 19 days was not long to wait, given the alternative. He understood what I meant by the alternative. He said, yes, given the alternative, 19 days is nothing. The afternoon moved toward evening. The light changed the way winter light changes. Not gradually, the way summer light eases itself out, but more decisively, more suddenly, as though it had a point to make about brevity. The street got quieter. A neighbor walked a dog past the house and waved without stopping, and Calvin raised a hand in the return wave of a man known in his neighborhood, settled into it, recognized. I thought about what it would mean to be known somewhere like that, to have lived in a place long enough to have the wordless exchange with the neighbor walking the dog. I had lived in my current apartment for 4 years, which was the longest I had been anywhere since leaving my mother's house for college, and I knew my neighbors by sight and by the sounds their lives made through the walls, but not in the wave from the porch way. I thought about whether I wanted that, whether I was a person who stayed places or a person who moved through them, whether the past several weeks had changed my answer to that question. Eventually I said I should probably get back to the hotel. He walked me to the door the way he had walked everything that day, unhurriedly, at his own pace, without the performative reluctance of someone manufacturing a goodbye. At the door he turned to me and he said, will you come back tomorrow, before you drive home? I have no agenda for it. I just think one day was not enough, and I would like more time if you are willing. I said yes without needing to think about it. He said, good, come in the morning again. I will make breakfast. I said, you do not have to do all this cooking. He said, I know I do not have to. That is the point of doing it. I walked to my car. I sat in it for a moment the way I had sat in it that morning before going to the door. But the feeling was entirely different. That morning I had been sitting with anticipation and uncertainty and the particular alertness of a person approaching an unknown. Now I was sitting with something that had weight and texture and warmth, something that was becoming real in the way that only actual encounters, not letters, not telephone calls, not imagined scenarios, can make things real. I drove back to the hotel. I sat at the desk. I opened my journal. I wrote for a long time. Not about what we had said, which I would process more slowly over more time, but about what it had felt like. The shortbread cookies, the blankets on the porch, the soup, the photograph of Louise, the neighbor with the dog, the laugh that landed warmly in the room, the way he had said, "I know I do not have to. That is the point of doing it." I wrote about what it was like to sit across from a person and look for yourself in them and find things and not find things, and understand that both the finding and the not finding were information. That inheritance was not only biological and not only temperamental, but was also something chosen, something accumulated, something that came from the people who showed up, and the people who were present, and the people who chose every day without being asked. Dorothy had given me things, and Calvin Reeves, a man I had known for one December day, had given me something too. Not a substitute for what I had from either of them, not a correction to the story I had lived, but an addition. A new room in a house I thought I already knew the full floor plan of. I went to sleep that night thinking about rooms, about floor plans, about the difference between a house you have mapped completely and a house that still has doors you have not yet opened. In the morning I drove back to the brick house on the quiet street. He had made breakfast. Of course he had. Eggs and toast and sliced fruit arranged on the table with the same quiet care as the shortbread cookies the day before. We ate and talked in the easier way of a second day, the first day formality having dissolved overnight into something more comfortable. He told me more about Simone and Marcus. He showed me more photographs. I told him more about my childhood, the specific details of it, the oak tree in the yard, Bobby's sweet potato pie, my mother's kitchen, and the particular quality of the light that came through its window on winter mornings. He listened to all of it with the same full attention he had brought to everything. At one point, when I was describing something small, the way my mother always had fresh flowers on the kitchen table, even in the months when money was tight, some weeks just weeds from the yard, arranged with the seriousness she brought to flowers from a proper florist, I saw something cross his face. I asked him what he was thinking. He said, "Louise always had flowers too. Always." She said a table without flowers was a table that had given up on itself. We sat with that for a moment, the strange and unrepeatable thing of a shared detail across 50 years and two completely separate lives. I left Memphis on Sunday afternoon. I stood at Calvin's door and we said goodbye the way people say goodbye when they mean to see each other again. Not the conclusive goodbye of a closed chapter, but the open-ended goodbye of a continuing story. He held out his hand first, formal, in the way his generation sometimes was, even with people it had decided to trust, and then he reconsidered and opened his arms, and I stepped into them and he held on for a moment, with the particular firmness of a person who has been waiting a long time to hold something they thought they had lost. I drove back to Alabama with the windows slightly cracked, even in the December cold, because I wanted the air on my face, the moving air of a life that was continuing forward, that had just added a room it had not previously contained. My mother had said, "When you are ready, keep going, because you are my daughter and that is what we do." I was going. I returned to Alabama on a Sunday evening in December, with the particular feeling of a person who has traveled somewhere significant, and come back changed in ways they have not yet fully catalogued. My apartment felt different when I walked into it. Not literally. It was exactly as I had left it, the deep green walls and the bookshelves and the desk by the south-facing window, and the cards my students had made arranged on the windowsill. But I moved through it differently, with a different awareness of the space, of what it contained, of what it meant that it was mine, and that I had built it, and that I was returning to it from Memphis with more of myself than I had left with. I put my bag down. I made tea. I stood at the window with the cup in my hands and looked out at the city in the Sunday evening dark, and I thought about Calvin Reeves in his brick house on his quiet street, probably doing whatever he did on Sunday evenings, reading perhaps, or watching something, or sitting with the particular quality of quiet that a person cultivates after decades of living alone, the quiet that is not empty, but is inhabited by memory and thought, and the ongoing interior life of someone who has not stopped paying attention to things. I thought about whether he was thinking about me. I thought he probably was. I thought about Marcus in Atlanta, urban planning, 2 hours from where I was standing. I had not allowed myself to think too specifically about Marcus during the Memphis trip, because there was already enough to hold, and adding the specific weight of that particular piece of it felt like more than the weekend could reasonably contain. But now I was home, and the trip was behind me, and the question of Marcus and Simone was still there, patient and present, waiting for me to be ready to face it directly. I was not ready yet. I acknowledged this to myself without judgment, the way I had learned to acknowledge things without judgment over the preceding weeks. The things I was not ready for, the things I needed more time with, the things that required a patience I was still learning to extend to myself, as naturally as I extended it to other people. Not yet did not mean not ever. It meant not yet. And not yet was a complete and legitimate answer. I went back to school the week after Christmas. My classroom had been waiting for me. The small chairs and the low tables and the alphabet frieze along the top of the wall, and the reading corner with its beanbag cushions and its carefully curated shelves of books chosen for 8-year-olds who were beginning to understand that stories were one of the primary ways the world made sense of itself. I stood in that room on the first morning back before the students arrived, and I looked at all of it, and I felt something settle in me that had been slightly unsettled since November. This was mine, this work, this room, these children who would come through the door in 20 minutes, and who would need my full presence and my full attention, and who would, in the particular alchemy of teaching, give me back exactly what I gave them, in the form of a reason to be fully present. Teaching had always been this for me, not an escape from my life, but an anchor in it. A place where the requirement to show up completely overrode the temptation to stay inside my own head, which was a temptation that had been stronger than usual in the preceding months for entirely understandable reasons. The children came in. They were loud in the way children are loud after a holiday break, full of stories about what they had received and where they had gone and what they had eaten and who they had seen, all of it tumbling out simultaneously without waiting for turns, because 8-year-olds have not yet fully mastered the art of sequential narration. I listened to all of it. I asked questions. I got down to their level the way I always did, and I looked them in the face and gave them the full quality of my attention that they had always been able to count on from me. Cora, the marine biologist, flashed through my mind. Calvin's granddaughter, 6 years old and certain about oceanic futures. I smiled to myself at something only I could fully understand the context of, which was its own small and private pleasure. I found my rhythm again. The school week, the weekends, the ongoing work of settling my mother's estate, which was moving through its legal and practical stages with the help of the attorney I had hired for that purpose. I visited my mother's house regularly. I had not yet decided what to do with it. Sell it, rent it, keep it for some period as yet undefined, and I was not rushing the decision. Some things needed to be held before they could be released, and the house was one of those things. I needed to be inside it a little longer, to move through its rooms with the new understanding I had of what had happened in them, before I could know what felt right. Calvin and I wrote to each other. Not constantly, neither of us was a constant correspondent, and we had both understood without discussing it explicitly that the relationship we were building was one that would develop at its own pace, and not be forced into a shape by an excess of communication. But regularly, every 2 weeks or so, a letter would arrive from Memphis, and I would read it and respond, and the correspondence had the quality of two people who have recognized something real in each other and are taking the appropriate time to understand what that real thing is and what it requires of them. He told me about his days, small things, a book he was reading, something one of the grandchildren had said, a repair he was making to the front porch that had turned out to be more complicated than anticipated. I told him about my students, about the particular comedies and dramas of 3rd grade, about a girl in my class named Amara, who was writing a story about a princess who was also a scientist, and who brought me a new page of it every Monday morning with the seriousness of a person submitting work they considered important. He wrote back about Amara with genuine interest and asked questions about her story that I passed along to her without full context, and she answered them with the unself-conscious thoroughness of a child who takes her creative work seriously, and I carried the answers back to Memphis in my next letter, a small and unlikely correspondence, threaded through the larger one. In February, I called him for the first time. We had stayed with letters because letters felt right, and neither of us had pushed toward the telephone. But one evening I was sitting at my desk with a particular question in my mind that felt too immediate for the 2-week turnaround of written correspondence, and I picked up my phone and I dialed the number he had included in his second letter. He answered after 3 rings. His voice on the telephone was the same as it had been in his living room, low and measured and warm. He said, "Diane?" And I said, "I hope this is all right?" And he said, "This is more than all right." We talked for 2 hours. The ease of it surprised me, though perhaps it should not have. We had been writing to each other for 6 weeks by then. We knew the shape of each other's thoughts, the way each of us approached things, the things that mattered to us, and the things we were still working out. The telephone was just the written correspondence made audible. It felt like a natural next step, rather than a leap. He told me that he had spoken to Simone. I sat up straighter when he said that. I said, "Tell me." He said he had called Simone on a Sunday morning, 2 weeks after my visit. He had asked her to come over, which was not unusual. She came often, lived nearby, was the person he called when he needed company or help, or simply the presence of someone who knew him well. She had come over, and they had sat at the kitchen table, the same table where he had served me soup, and he had told her. He said he had told her everything, the way he had told things throughout this story, directly, completely, without softening it beyond what honesty required. He had told her about Dorothy and the brief involvement in Alabama 50 years ago. He had told her about the pregnancy and his agreement to step away and the letter he had written to Bobby Williams. He had told her about my letter arriving in December and his response and my visit and the correspondence since. He said Simone had been very quiet throughout, which was unusual for Simone, who was by nature and by practice a verbal and expressive person. He said her quietness told him she was processing at a depth that required the silence, the way sometimes the most significant things produce the most complete stillness in us before anything else is possible. When he finished, she had asked him one question. She had asked, "Is she good people?" He said he had told her yes, that he believed I was. She had said, "Then I want to meet her, when she's ready, when you're both ready. I want to meet my sister." I sat at my desk in my apartment with my phone against my ear, and my eyes full, and I did not say anything for a moment. Calvin on the other end of the line waited, the way he had learned to wait, understanding that some responses needed their own time to arrive. I said, "She called me her sister." He said, "Yes, that is who you are to her. She does not do things halfway, Simone. Once she has decided something is true, she names it correctly and moves forward. It is one of her qualities I have always admired." I said, "What about Marcus?" He said, "Marcus is next. I am telling him in person, which means waiting until he comes to Memphis, which he does every few months. I will tell him then." I said, "How do you think he will take it?" Calvin was quiet for a moment. He said, "Marcus processes things slowly. He is methodical, as I told you. He will need time to organize the information and decide what he thinks about it before he can speak about what he feels about it. But he is a fair man. He does not make decisions from reaction. I expect that once he has had the time to process it, he will arrive at the same place Simone has arrived, which is that the truth is the truth, and a person is a person, and both of those things deserve to be acknowledged." He said, "I could be wrong. I have been wrong before. But I know my son." I said, "I trust your knowing." He said, "Thank you for that." March came. Calvin called me the day after Marcus arrived in Memphis. He did not give me details over the phone. He said that was Marcus's information to share or not share as he chose, that the conversation had happened, and that Marcus knew, and that beyond that it was Marcus's story to tell. He said, "Give him time." He said, "He has my number and your number, and when he is ready he will use one of them." I said, "Okay." I went back to my life. I taught Amara and the rest of my third graders. I continued settling my mother's estate. I visited her house on weekends, and sat in the kitchen, and stood under the oak tree, and slowly, incrementally, began to understand what I wanted to do with it. What I wanted to do, I eventually understood, was keep it. Not as a museum, not as a place preserved exactly as it had been, but as a living place. A place I continued to inhabit and tend and bring forward with me, rather than sealing behind me. The house was not only my mother's grief and my father Bobby's quiet, enormous choice, and the kept secret of 41 years. It was also my childhood. It was also the kitchen where we had cooked, and the table where we had eaten, and the yard where Bobby had taught me to catch a ball, and my mother had grown tomatoes. It was all of those things simultaneously, and the complexity of it did not cancel any of it out. I started going there more regularly. I planted things in the spring, in the beds my mother had kept. Not tomatoes immediately, that felt like too specific a homage to attempt before I was ready, but flowers first, the kind she would have approved of. Practical and beautiful both. In April, I received a text message from a number I did not recognize. It said, "This is Marcus Reeves. I got your number from my father. I have been thinking about what to say for 3 weeks, and I'm still not sure I have the right words, but I know waiting any longer is not making it easier. If you are open to talking, I would like to talk." I read that message 3 times. I thought about what Calvin had told me, methodical, principled, the man who reads the instructions before attempting anything and always has the right tool for the job. I thought about a man who had been sitting with 3 weeks of thinking, and had decided that waiting was not helping, and had reached for the phone. I thought about what it had taken me to reach for my own phone the first time I called Calvin. The particular gathering of yourself that reaching requires. The decision to move toward the unknown rather than away from it. "Whenever you are ready." He called the next evening. Marcus's voice was different from his father's. Where Calvin was warm and measured, Marcus was precise and careful, the voice of a man who chose his words with the thoroughness of someone who understood that words once released could not be recalled, and wanted to be sure about them before releasing them. But underneath the precision there was something else. Something that came through in the pauses between sentences, and in the particular quality of the listening. I could feel him listening through the phone, the way you can feel certain people's listening, the full attentiveness of it, that told me Calvin had been right. He was a fair man. Whatever he was working through, he was working through it honestly. He told me he was not sure how he felt. He said it directly, without apology for the uncertainty, which I respected. He said he had grown up as his father's son and his mother's son, and Simone's brother, and that his sense of his own family was something he had carried with confidence his whole life, and that the addition of new information to that picture required an adjustment he was still in the process of making. He said he did not say this to make me feel unwelcome. He said it because he was not going to pretend to a warmth he had not yet fully located, and then fail to produce it, because that would be a disservice to both of us. I said I appreciated the honesty more than I could say. He said, "Simone says you are easy to talk to." I said, "You have spoken to Simone about me?" He said, "Simone has spoken to me about you. That is slightly different. She called me the day after my father told her, and she has been calling me every week since. She has strong opinions about this situation, and she is not shy about sharing them." He heard it, and something in his voice shifted, very slightly. Loosened, maybe, by a fraction. He said, "Yes, that is Simone." We talked for an hour that first call. Not about the deep things. Those would come later, in subsequent conversations, as the calls became more regular, and the careful precision of his manner had more time to coexist with the growing familiarity between us. We talked about his work, which he described with the same specific love that his father had described Memphis. The love of a person who has found the thing they are genuinely suited to, and has the daily satisfaction of doing it. We talked about Atlanta, which I knew only as the city I drove through on the way to larger distances. He offered, without pressure, to tell me about it if I ever wanted to know. The offer was small, but it was an opening. It was Marcus Reeves, methodical and principled, and still in the process of adjustment, holding a door open with the careful, deliberate gesture of a man who reads instructions before beginning, and wanted to make sure he was doing this right. I said, I would like that. By May, I had spoken to Simone directly. She had called me herself, on a Saturday morning, with the cheerful directness of a woman who had decided something and was acting on it. She had said, "I have been waiting for you to call me, and then I realized I was waiting for something I could just do myself, so here I am calling you. I hope that is all right." I had said, "It is completely all right." We talked for 3 hours. I did not plan to talk for 3 hours. It simply happened, the way conversations happen when two people discover they have a great deal of natural ease with each other, and neither of them has the impulse to cut it short. She was exactly what Calvin had described, and also more than the description. warmer and funnier and more perceptive and more direct. The particular combination of qualities that produces people who become the center of gravity in their families and their communities, because everyone around them can feel that being with them is simply better than not being with them. She asked me about my mother, not with caution or with the navigating around quality that some people brought to the subject of Dorothy, as though she were a wound rather than a person. She asked about her directly and with genuine curiosity, the way she asked about everything. She wanted to know who Dorothy was. Not the outline of the story, she had that from Calvin, but the texture of the person. What she had been like in an ordinary day. What made her laugh. What she had been like as a mother. I told her all of it, the composure and the faith and the kitchen and the flowers on the table, even in tight months, and the way she had listened to everything without saying it was fine when it was not fine, and the morning she had put her hand over mine and let me cry in the car. I told her about Bobby, too, about the sweet potato pie, and the Little League, and the manila envelope, and the choice made in the back of a closet that had taken 40 years to come to light. Simone was quiet for a moment when I finished talking about Bobby. Then she said, "Lord, that man." I said yes. She said, "I want to tell you something and I want you to hear it the way I mean it, and not some other way." I said okay. She said, "You were loved. Whatever else is complicated about this story, that part is not complicated. You were chosen and loved by two people who did not have to do it the way they did it, and who did it anyway, completely, without an audience, without being asked." I know this is a lot to process, and I know some of it is grief and some of it is disorienting, and I am not trying to rush you past any of that. But I want you to know that from where I am sitting, as a person who is looking at your story from the outside with fresh eyes, what I see is a woman who was profoundly, specifically, quietly loved. I sat with that for a long time after we hung up, the way you sit with something that has landed precisely where it needed to land. In June, I drove to Atlanta. I had not planned it dramatically. I had mentioned to Marcus in one of our calls that I was going to be in Atlanta for a professional development conference at the end of the month, which was true. My school district sent several of us each year, and I had been scheduled to attend for months before any of this began. He had said, "If you have time while you are here, I would be glad to show you some of the city the way I offered." Still no pressure, just an open door. I said I had time. We met for dinner on a Thursday evening, a restaurant he had chosen with the methodical care he brought to choices. Good food, quiet enough to talk, not so formal that it placed additional pressure on an already somewhat pressured meeting. He was already at the table when I arrived, which told me he had come early, which told me something about his state of mind that his careful precision was working to conceal. He stood when he saw me. He was tall like his father and like me, which was the first physical thing I noticed, the shared height of it. And he had his father's coloring and something of his mother Louise in the shape of his face that I could see because Calvin had shown me photographs. He put out his hand first, the same gesture his father had made in Memphis before reconsidering. And I shook it, and then we both sat down and looked at each other across a restaurant table in Atlanta, with the slightly formal air of two people who have spoken many times and are now, for the first time, in the same physical room. He said, "It is different in person." I said, "Yes, it always is." He said, "You look like my father." I am not sure why that surprises me, but it does. I said, "It surprised me too when I first saw him. The parts of yourself you recognize in someone else. It is a strange and specific thing." He said, "Yes." We ordered dinner. We talked with the increasing ease of two people discovering that the months of phone calls have done the work they needed to do, and that what is left in person is not starting over, but continuing from where the calls left off, just with the additional information that physical presence provides, the way a person holds themselves, the way they listen, the way they move through the world at the speed and angle that is specifically theirs. Marcus was exactly as Calvin had described, and exactly as he had revealed himself to be in the phone calls, and also in person, something more than both of those. He was a man who was genuinely interested in things, not the performed interest of social courtesy, but the deep active interest of someone whose work required them to think carefully about how places were built and how people lived in them and what made the difference between a community that worked and one that didn't. He talked about Atlanta with the specificity of someone who saw a city in 3 dimensions and across time, rather than just as the present-day surface of it. I told him about my mother's house, about the decision to keep it, to plant things in it, to bring it forward, rather than seal it behind me. He listened, and then he said, "That is exactly right. That is what you do with a place that matters. You keep it living." We talked for 3 hours over dinner. When we walked out of the restaurant onto the Atlanta evening street, he asked if I wanted to walk for a while, and I said yes, and we walked for another hour through neighborhoods he knew, and pointed out things he found interesting, with the quiet pleasure of a person sharing something they love with someone they hope will love it too. At the end of the evening he said, "I am glad you came." I said, "So am I." He said, "Simone wants to know when we are all going to be in the same place at the same time. She has been asking me this for 3 months, and I did not have an answer until possibly now." I said, "What does possibly now mean?" He said, "It means I think we are getting there, if you want to be." I said, "I want to be." He nodded. He said, "Then we will figure out the when and the where, and Simone will probably take over the planning the moment we give her the opening, and it will become considerably more elaborate than any of us intended." I laughed. I said, "I am looking forward to meeting the person who makes things considerably more elaborate than anyone intended." He said, "She will consider that the highest compliment." I drove back to my hotel that night through Atlanta streets I did not yet know well, but that felt already like somewhere I had a small claim on. A city where someone knew me, where someone had walked with me for an hour, pointing at things he loved, where a door had been opened with the careful, deliberate gesture of a man who does things properly, and who, having decided I was someone worth opening a door for, had opened it all the way. I sat in the hotel room that night, and I thought about the year that had passed since my mother had called my name from her bedroom in that specific, deliberate way. The year that had begun in a hospital room with the slant of afternoon light and my mother's hands folded on the blanket and a sentence that rearranged everything. I thought about what the year had given me and what it had taken, and what I understood now that I had not understood before. I understood that the people who love us are not simple, that the love itself can be real and complete and true, while existing alongside things that are complicated, things kept, things carried, things managed with the imperfect human tools of fear and protection, and the sincere and flawed intention to do what is right. I understood that finding out the complicated things about the people who loved us does not undo the love. It complicates it. It makes it larger and more human and more honest. And a love that is large and human and honest is not a smaller thing than a love that is simple and clean. It is, in most of the ways that matter, a greater one. I understood that family is not only what you are born into, and not only what finds you later, and not only what you choose, and not only what chooses you. It is all of those things operating simultaneously and non-exclusively, each of them real, none of them canceling the others out. Bobby Williams was my father. Dorothy Williams was my mother. Calvin Reeves was something I was still finding words for. Not a replacement for either of them, not a correction to the story I had lived, but a real and living addition to it. A person I was glad to know, a presence that had arrived late and was welcome anyway. Marcus was something. Simone was something. The words were still coming. I understood that the truth, even when it is enormous and disorienting and arrives at the worst possible time, is better than the alternative. My mother had known this. It was why she had finally told me, in the last weeks of the time she had. She had understood that the weight of the keeping was less bearable than the weight of the telling, and that I deserved the chance to carry my own truth, rather than having it carried on my behalf by people who loved me, but who were not me. I was carrying it now, all of it, in both hands, openly, without pretending it was lighter than it was. It was not light, but I was strong enough for it. I had learned this the hard way and the long way, and I knew it now in the deep way that you know things that have been demonstrated to you by your own life, rather than simply told to you by someone else's. The summer came. In August, on a Saturday, I drove to Memphis. Not for a quiet visit this time, not for the careful exploratory first meeting or the gradual building of the second. This time I drove to Memphis because Simone had, exactly as Marcus had predicted, taken over the planning the moment she was given the opening, and had organized something that was considerably more elaborate than any of us had individually intended. She had arranged a lunch at Calvin's house with Calvin and herself and her husband Jerome and their 3 children and Marcus, who had driven from Atlanta, and me. She had set the table with what Calvin quietly told me over the phone was Louise's good china that came out only for significant occasions, and that he had not seen on that table since Louise herself had put it there. I pulled up to the brick house on the quiet street, and there were cars in the driveway and along the curb, and through the front window I could see movement and color, and the particular animated quality of a house that is full of people who are glad to be together. I sat in my car for a moment, the same 3 minutes as the first time, in December, when the house had been quiet and the street had been still, and I had been arriving at something I could not fully see the shape of yet. The shape was clearer now. Not completely clear. It never would be completely clear, because the things that matter are always more complex than any single view of them, and I had learned to be comfortable with that, rather than needing the clean resolution that complexity refuses to provide. But clearer, larger and more specific, and more real than it had been on that December morning. I got out of the car. The front door opened before I reached it. Simone was there. I knew her immediately, not from photographs, though I had seen those, but from the quality of her presence, which was exactly what Calvin and Marcus had described, and also entirely itself. She was smiling the wide, specific smile of a woman who had been waiting for this, and had decided some time ago that it was going to be good. She said, "There you are. Not welcome, not hello, not nice to finally meet you," as though I had been somewhere she knew about all along, and had simply been waiting to arrive. I said, "Here I am." She stepped forward, and she hugged me the way women hug each other when they mean it, fully, without the performative brevity of a polite first-meeting embrace. I hugged her back. Through the door behind her I could hear voices and children and the sound of a house that was alive with people and food, and the accumulated warmth of a family that had gathered, because gathering was what they did when something mattered enough. She stepped back and looked at me. She said, "You have Daddy's forehead." I told him, and he pretended not to know what I was talking about. I laughed. She laughed. From inside the house, Marcus appeared in the doorway behind her, with the small smile of a man who had been waiting for his sister to say exactly that. I walked through the door. The house was full of people who were becoming, in their different paces and their different ways, something to me. Calvin was in the kitchen, of course, doing something at the stove with the unhurried focus of a man in his element. He looked up when I came in and he said, "Diane," and he said it the way he had said it from the beginning. Just my name, simple and complete, as though my name and his voice contained everything that needed to be said. The children were everywhere in the specific way that children are everywhere, when given the freedom of a house that welcomes them. Cora, the future marine biologist, found me within 5 minutes, and began telling me about a documentary she had seen about octopuses, with the urgent thoroughness of a 6-year-old, who has recently acquired important information and needs to make sure the adults around her understand its significance. I crouched down to her level and listened with the full quality of attention I brought to my students, and she responded to it immediately, the way children always respond to being genuinely heard, by telling me more and more and more. Calvin watched us from the kitchen doorway. When I looked up and caught his eye, he gave me a single small nod, the nod of a man who had asked for one thing 50 years ago and was watching it arrive in the form of his daughter crouched on his living room floor, listening to his granddaughter explain octopuses with complete seriousness. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was, in the particular accounting of lives and what they add up to, an extraordinary abundance. We sat down to eat at the table set with Louise's good china, Calvin at the head of it, Simone at the other end, Marcus and Jerome and the children arranged between them, and me, beside Calvin, in the chair that Simone had placed there with the deliberateness she brought to everything she organized, because she had understood without being told that it was the right place. Calvin said grace. He did it the way my mother had done it her whole life, not performatively, not at length, but with the simple and genuine quality of a person addressing someone they actually believe is listening. He thanked God for the food, and for the hands that had made it, and for the people around the table. He paused for a moment at the end of the list of people around the table, a pause that lasted just long enough to tell everyone who was paying attention that he was including the newest one, and that the inclusion was not incidental. He said amen. Everyone said amen. Simone began passing food. The children immediately began a small negotiation about who got which serving bowl first, that Jerome resolved with the efficient patience of a man who had been doing exactly this for years. Marcus poured drinks with the methodical care he brought to everything. Calvin sat at the head of the table and looked at the people around it with the expression of a man who is aware, in this moment, of everything that is good in his life. I sat beside him, and I thought about my mother, about Bobby, about the kitchen in Alabama, and the oak tree in the yard, and the letters on lined notebook paper, and a December drive to Memphis, and an Atlanta evening walking through streets I was beginning to know, about Amara and her princess scientist story, about my students and my classroom and my green walls and the morning light on the desk by the window, about all of it, the full, complicated, abundant, difficult, beautiful accumulation of it. My name is Diane, and I want to tell you something before I finish. There will be people in your life who keep things from you out of love, who make decisions on your behalf that were not theirs to make, who carry secrets that were yours to know, who protect you in ways that also, in some measure, diminish you. This is one of the most complex things about being loved by imperfect people, which is the only kind of people there are. What I want you to know is that the uncovering does not undo the love. The truth, even when it arrives late and heavy and rearranging, does not cancel what was real. Bobby Williams chose me. Dorothy Williams raised me with everything she had. Calvin Reeves asked for one thing and waited 50 years to find out if it had been honored. These are all true simultaneously. The complexity does not reduce any of them. And the people who come into your life afterward, the Simones who say, "There you are," as though you were never missing, only temporarily misplaced, the Marcuses who sit with 3 weeks of thinking before reaching for the phone, and who walk with you through cities they love because they have decided, carefully and deliberately, that you are worth sharing it with. The Calvins who bake shortbread cookies and bring out blankets for the porch and say, "I know I do not have to, that's the point of doing it." These people are also real. Their arrival does not replace what came before. It adds to it. It extends the table. Whatever table you are sitting at, however it was built and whoever built it, and whatever complicated history lives underneath it, there is room at it for the truth. For the people the truth brings with it. For the expansion of your own understanding of who you are and where you come from and what family in its fullest and most honest sense actually means. There is room. My name is Diane. I am my mother's daughter. I am my father Bobby's daughter. I am, in a new and still forming way, Calvin Reeves's daughter too. I am sitting at a table in Memphis, set with Louise's good china, with a 6-year-old telling me about octopuses, and a man saying grace with a pause in it that means everything, and a woman across from me who says, "There you are," like she always knew where I was. I am in every way that matters, exactly where I belong, and that is my story.